In a spacious, luxuriously decorated room filled with soft light, a baby, lying in an elegant cradle, made cheerful sounds, and tiny hands reached up, as if trying to touch something invisible, but infinitely alluring. It was a tiny girl with a radiant smile, and looking at her, it seemed as if someone's distant, forgotten image was reflected in her. A girl who had left this world and had been learning for 100 days to begin a new life in another, unknown existence. The maid, carrying neatly folded linen in her hands, noticed with joy that the little mistress had already woken up, and her eyes reflected the tenderness of awakening, and the air was filled with the warm light of the morning rays, gently playing on the thin fabrics of the canopy. Taking the tiny girl in her arms, the maid smiled softly, rocking her gently and quietly, said that she would do everything possible to take care of her with affection and warmth, as if she were the most precious treasure that fate had entrusted to her caring hands. This girl's past life was a difficult test, full of loneliness and difficulties. She grew up an orphan, never knowing the warmth of her parents' home, and she had no friends, only an endless struggle for a place in the sun, among strangers and indifferent people. But now, as if fate itself had decided to give her a second chance, she lived in luxury, surrounded by care, and in her heart there finally settled hope that ahead of her was something more than just existence, but a real life, shining like pure gold. Suddenly, the heavy door creaked open, and a man appeared on the threshold, pausing for a moment, as if hesitating before taking a step forward, his gaze wary and the air filled with tension, foreshadowing something important. The maid hurriedly bowed deeply, respectfully greeting the gentleman with hair as thick as the night sky, whose name was Go Young Ma, and whose mere presence filled the room with a sense of grandeur, causing the air to tremble with an invisible power. Before her stood an unusually handsome man, whose long, silky-like black hair fell over his shoulders, and whose rich clothes, woven from dark brocade and decorated with graceful patterns reminiscent of ancient Chinese ornaments, shimmered in the candlelight. A mentor who does not tolerate delays and keeps to the point with dignity, he gave orders to his junior disciple, a young man named Ak Wu Ran, who was standing nearby, to immediately pay his respects to the lady, but despite all his composure, confusion flashed in the disciple's eyes. The man's hair was neatly pinned back with an elegant gold clip, adding to his appearance, and his scarlet eyes, like flaming rubies, contrasted with his flawless white skin, creating an image in which beauty and grandeur were intertwined. The little girl, looking with curiosity at the man who entered, was so charmed by his noble appearance that she mentally, without thinking, gave him the highest score, 10 out of 10, not hiding her delight in her naive but sincere admiration. Standing next to him, dressed in an elegant purple hanfu, was a boy whose long hair was neatly tied into a ponytail at the side, and a jade pendant glittered on his chest, giving him the appearance of not just a student, but a young heir to a noble family, raised in the spirit of nobility. Not wanting to, but still obeying the requirements of etiquette, the young man reluctantly introduced himself, saying that his name was Ak Wu Ran, but indifference was clearly heard in his voice, and irritation reigned in his thoughts, because he was not at all eager to be here, much less to get acquainted with girl. The child frowned, looking closely at the young man whose name, sounding in the room, seemed strangely familiar to her, as if she had heard it once in a distant, barely perceptible memory. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not remember where she knew him from. The teacher bowed his head thoughtfully, thought for a moment, as if weighing something important, and then, in a restrained and majestic voice, said that from now on this girl would bear a new name, and it was Chung Li Hua, a name that had a special meaning. The little girl, hearing this unexpected statement, froze in place in shock, realizing that from that moment on, she no longer had a previous name, that she was now Chung Li Hua, and this thought, like lightning, pierced her consciousness, making her heart beat faster from surprise. A loud, despairing, and shocking cry echoed throughout the estate, shaking the silence as the newcomer finally realized the terrible truth. She was no longer in her world, but found herself in ancient China, in a world of martial arts, full of secrets, dangers, and fateful trials. It was a historical novel, that intertwined mystical themes and a dark atmosphere. And at the center of the plot was a demonic cult that sowed chaos, destruction, and fear throughout the country, subjugating the weak and destroying anyone who dared to stand in its way. In order to counter the treachery of the dark cultivators, a great alliance was formed on the ruins of the former order, uniting the strongest martial artists, whose main goal was to stop the advancing darkness and destroy the root of evil. The final boss in this story was Go Young Ma himself, a man whose name inspired fear, and whose blade, covered in the scarlet blood of his enemies, became a symbol of merciless terror, because his strength and cruelty knew no equal, and his ambitions extended far beyond mortal existence. One day, while wandering through the ashes of a destroyed village, a man found a little boy who, despite his fear and confusion, looked at him with eyes full of pain, and, having decided to make him his heir, he killed the child's parents without hesitation. When the young man turned 23, realizing who his adoptive father really was, he escaped from the cult, led the alliance, and, hardened by battles, was finally able to take revenge on the man who raised him as a son, but at the same time was not just a man, but a true demon. The young daughter of the sinister leader of the demonic cult, like many others, became a poor victim of his countless atrocities, and the female life was cut short as cruelly as those he destroyed for his own strength and great power. The girl burst into tears, her scream echoing through the room as she realized the terrifying truth. She had been reborn into this world not as someone great, but as a minor character in a Chinese novel, whose fate was sealed and whose end was inevitably terrible. The boy, wincing in irritation, quickly covered his ears with his hands, because the loud crying of the child was getting on his nerves, depriving him of his already meager patience, and the sound of this desperate sobbing only irritated him. The head of the demonic cult, whose aura inspired fear and respect, stood to the side, showing no emotion, merely folding his arms across his chest and observing the events with his usual indifference, as if none of this had anything to do with him. Go Jung Ma, with a cold glint in his scarlet eyes, turned to the servant and asked him directly why his daughter was crying. But the servant, pale with fear, felt as if his tongue had grown to the roof of his mouth, and, unable to utter a word, he only bowed silently in a deep bow. Receiving no answer, he repeated his question again, insistently and threateningly. His patience was running out, and his readiness to resort to cruel measures became obvious, because in his eyes there was a fire of uncontrollable rage, ready to burn everything in its path. So Ren, feeling the weight of the gazes and the cold air that surrounded her, bowed her head to the master, frightenedly stammering that she did not know why the young mistress was crying, feeling her heart clench in fear of punishment. Coming closer to the servant, the clan leader stepped forward with icy confidence. His face remained impassive, but there was a dark threat in his voice as he quietly, but with merciless anger, asked if she was the girl's nanny. Then why didn't she know basic things? The threat of death piercing his words. The maid, unable to bear the pressure of fear, fell to her knees, touching her forehead to the ground. Her eyes filled with pleading and her voice trembled with fear as she begged for mercy from her merciless master, fully aware that a woman's life depended on his whim. Without thinking twice, the man grinned predatorily. His eyes flashed with a cold fire, and, drawing his sword from its sheath, said that since the servant was useless and could not perform the simplest duties, then her fate was decided. Death was inevitable. Suddenly, the boy interrupted the master, saying that the girl might be frightened by such a murder, and asked him to deal with the servant himself in another place, not wanting the younger mistress to witness this terrible act. The mentor, having listened to his little subordinate, nodded in agreement and allowed him to take the nanny out of here, and then deal with her in another place, away from prying eyes, considering that this would be more reasonable and safe for all parties. Coming closer, the servant asked for one last favor, with a trembling voice, asking to console the little mistress before leaving, who was still crying bitterly, hoping to ease her suffering a little before leaving this world. Go Jung Ma, with his arms folded across his chest, coldly reminded that the maid had already failed once in her service to the little mistress. But the girl, despite all the difficulties, persistently asked for a second chance to prove her loyalty. And so, finally, Go Young-ma made the long-awaited decision to have the nanny allow the baby to truly enjoy his last moment of peace, while taking care of his little daughter, who needed his attention and support. Raising her head and looking at her benefactors, So Ren expressed her sincere gratitude for the opportunity, feeling the tears that slid down her face as a symbol of gratitude for what she had received. Gently lifting the baby into her arms, she gently whispered to the child to stop crying, because the woman's heart ached when she saw these tears filling the girl's face and felt how her soul was tormented by this suffering. Pulling herself together and holding back her tears, Chung Li-hua resolutely decided not to give in to her emotions anymore. Realizing that her weakness could betray the kind-hearted nanny, and such hopelessness would lead to even more suffering, and she promised herself to be strong so as not to become a burden. The boys, standing in anticipation, did not take their eyes off the lady, with invisible anxiety in their eyes, watching her every movement, watching with interest whether the maid would be able to calm this girl down, and perhaps avoid what was already so close. Terrible consequences for her. Coldly, as if devoid of any compassion, the cult boss gave the order to the maid to immediately go out and await her fate outside, knowing that in this game there would be no pity or mercy, and her fate was decided without the right to correction, where her future was predetermined. Frightened, desperate, and with no small amount of fear, the little girl clutched the servant's kimono with her hands, not wanting to let go of it for a second, realizing that as soon as the nanny left, only death awaited the poor lady she loved so much, and this thought tormented her, making her heart beat faster. The maid slowly began to let the girl go to bed, wanting her to sleep peacefully, but the woman's heart was squeezed with tenderness, because she understood how difficult it was to part with the baby, knowing that she would have to meet with something that could change everything. But the poor little girl did not let sweet So Ren go. She grabbed her finger tightly with her little hand and squeezed it with such force that it seemed as if it was her last hope for salvation, for protection, and for that love that she did not want to lose. Under the watchful eyes of her masters, the woman begged her mistress with obvious desperation to let her go. But Chung Li-hua, with unwavering determination in her eyes, did not give in to her requests, because she was sure that now everything should be according to the woman's will, despite the pain. Sadly, with tears on her cheeks, the girl began to cry, not wanting the nanny to leave, because she understood that her departure would bring danger, and her tears were the last chance to save the woman risking her life for her. Thoughtfully, the curly-haired man murmured that it seemed his little daughter did not want to part with her, and in these words, there was not only a deeply hidden sadness, but also the realization of how hard it is to let go of those who are so dear to you. The young man noticed with surprise how his teacher began to adjust the bracers on his hands, and his eyes reflected something more than just a mechanical movement, as if behind this simple action there was some secret that he himself could not yet understand. His palms were the palms of a killer, seemingly clean, but hiding darkness and blood deep down, not visible on the surface, but obvious enough for someone who could read between the lines and see what others tried to hide. His hand clenched tightly into a fist, and at that moment it became obvious that the decision had been made, that he could no longer retreat, and now his actions would be decisive and irrevocable, as always happens when a person decides to go all the way. The Yakuza leader turned around and sternly ordered So-ren to find out why his daughter was crying, and not to bother him with any more anxious questions, making it clear that this matter required a solution, and his nerves could not withstand unnecessary worries. The boy obediently followed his teacher, and before he left, he glanced back at the child, and his heart sank, because he couldn't help but knew he had to follow the order, and without thinking, he continued walking without looking back. Chung Li-hua finally calmed down and stopped crying, feeling how the heavy burden on her female soul began to disappear little by little, and as soon as the guys left, she immediately felt better, as if all the tension that had been weighing her down had suddenly melted away like the morning fog. According to the plot of the novel, which unfolds in a historical context, the main character is a Chinese woman, beautiful but cruel inside, who turns out to be the daughter of the head of a demonic cult, and this secret of her origin gradually reveals her entire dark side. At the end of the story, the protagonist killed the girl not only out of revenge, but also for her atrocities, realizing that her actions led to inevitable tragic consequences, and only in this way could he end her destructive influence on everyone around her. The girl firmly clenched her fists, deciding that she would never repeat the fate of the heroine, would not sacrifice her life for someone's revenge or plans, and of course, would not agree to die at the end of the book, despite everything that awaited her ahead. But her joyful expression gradually faded, giving way to gloomy thoughtfulness and deep sadness, because there was too much in front of her that had to be experienced and corrected, and she remained just a child, locked in a small and weak body. Go Jung-ma and the maid entered the room, and the father, noticing their presence, noted with surprise that this time his baby did not cry, but behaved calmly and quietly, as if she herself understood the importance of what was happening and was prepared for any situation that might arise. Oddly enough, the girl began to drool, as if trying to push the boy away, not wanting him to come too close, her small body instinctively rejecting his presence, and she tried to avoid his approach, feeling strangely uneasy. Go Jung-ma found himself covered in his child's drool. His clothes and face were dirty, but he didn't pay attention, absorbed in caring for his daughter, while the maid behind him worriedly began to ask if the head of the family was okay. Noticing his strange behavior, the girl began to look for a handkerchief for the gentleman, but he briefly replied that it was not necessary. His words were clear and confident, as always, leaving no room for discussion, which made her freeze in place, realizing that insisting was pointless. The maids constantly discussed their little mistress, admiring her charming big cheeks and sweet, innocent look that always made everyone around her smile, filling their hearts with tenderness. Wiping the remaining moisture from his face with his hand, Go Jung-ma began to watch his daughter closely again, his red eyes full of quiet interest, and his face remained calm, as if he was trying to understand what was hidden in the woman's little soul. The little girl shuddered, feeling completely helpless, like a little mouse trapped in a trap, and her body involuntarily trembled with fear and uncertainty, as if she had been thrown into a world that was alien to her, in which she did not know how to survive or what to expect. As the girl reached out to her father, it was the parent's turn to flinch in surprise. His eyes widened and his heart skipped a beat, because he didn't know how to properly handle small children, and this feeling of confusion overwhelmed him. The man, with his deep knowledge of martial arts, instinctively used them, taking a quick step back, as if he was afraid of something invisible. His movements were fast and sharp, as if he was trying to protect himself from something unknown. Frustrated, Chung Li-hua always felt that her life was spent in the shadow of others, because although her parents loved their children, they often paid attention to everyone around them, but her father never showed concern for her or even touched her, leaving her alone. He just stood there with his arms folded across his chest like an emotionless monster, showing no emotion at all, his gaze cold and indifferent, as if he was distant and alien, unable to understand or feel the pain of those around him. Looking down, the little girl realized that her dream of becoming her daddy's favorite girl was disappearing, as was all hope that she would take a special place in his life, because instead of care and attention, she felt only coldness and alienation. The only plan left was to escape, but the girl was terribly afraid that Ak Woo-ran would pursue her, thirsting for revenge and trying to find her, because she was sure that his anger could be incredibly terrible and destructive for her future. In order for her to be able to stay in the central area and maintain her independence as a woman, she not only needed to adapt to life in the area, but also to master martial arts, which would allow her to feel protected and confident in any situation. The girl, lost in thought, was looking for an answer to an important question. Who could she find as an assistant to master the fighting style and become stronger? Because she could hardly get the necessary help from her father, given his attitude towards women's education. Suddenly, a woman entered the room, striking in her beauty. Her hair was snow-white, her face seemed like marble, and her features were refined and perfect. In a blue kimono, she stood like the embodiment of elegance and greeted the head of the clan. The lady approached the boy with a slight smile on her lips, noting that the rumors about how often he came to visit his daughter turned out to be true, and she couldn't help but be glad that these conversations actually had some basis. The little girl, with slight surprise, wondered if this woman was her real mother, because her presence caused a strange, barely perceptible feeling, as if something long forgotten had suddenly returned, leaving many unresolved questions in the girl's heart. The woman, with feigned kindness, addressed the girl, expressing her joy at how much she missed her, but added with a slight smile that despite this, she did not have time to spend more time with the little one. Taking the girl in her arms, the lady again turned to the gentleman with gratitude that it was thanks to him that she was able to become a mother, and her words sounded as if they were carefully thought out, full of hypocrisy and falsehood, while leaving a feeling of emptiness. The man stood to the side, silently watching them, his gaze cold and unperturbed, as if he was unaffected by the whole scene. And although he did not say a word, his presence was felt in the air, filling it with a heavy, silent power. The girl did not hide her displeasure when her so-called mother began to press her to herself. Her smile was filled with sly hypocrisy, and with each of her movements, the girl increasingly felt how she was becoming ill from the spiritual emptiness and lies of this woman. The woman's hands gripped the fabric tightly, pressing the girl against her, causing her pain. And with every movement she made, the small body felt more and more tension, as if her existence was secondary and had no meaning in her arms. Unable to contain her emotions, the girl began to cry loudly, and the woman, with a cold smile on her face, responded by claiming that the girl must have missed her so much, trying to hide her falsehood, disguising it under false kindness and care. The lady, with a slight expression of regret on her face, began to explain her lie, claiming that she was afraid of infecting her baby and therefore did not come to her. But the woman's words were empty, and there was no sincerity in her eyes, only a cold distance. Go Youngma refused the offer of a family dinner without saying a word, simply turning away, his red hair fluttering behind him like a symbol of alienation, emphasizing his determination to maintain his distance and detachment from everything that was happening. The man, taking a step towards the door, left the room, and the woman was left alone in the room, with her daughter in her arms, who was holding on with difficulty in her arms, while the maid stood nearby, carefully watching her every movement, as if waiting for her reaction. Instantly, the beauty's whole expression changed, and her mood sank, hiding an internal struggle. She turned sharply to the maid, her voice sounding dark and harsh as she said that her daughter was simply incredibly heavy. Without looking back, she pushed her daughter away from her with firmness and determination, while the maid, with panic in her eyes and desperate haste, rushed forward to catch the little girl, who suddenly found herself in serious danger. While the maid consoled the frightened child, the lady walked away, thoughtfully thinking, because she had just learned that her lover came here every day to see their daughter, bringing with him tender feelings and care. The noble lady, a little tired of thinking, sat down and, resting her head on her hand, said with a slight smile that at first she thought that her child would be helpless after birth, but it turned out that the baby could be useful in the future. Without even thinking, the white-haired beauty abruptly snatched the rattle from the maid's hands, interrupting the innocent game with the child with such cruelty as if this game was just a trifle, not worth her attention or effort. With a cold, cruel smile on her lips, the lady said that it seemed she had finally found a use for the girl, hinting at using her for her own purposes, without bothering herself with moral reflection on the consequences of her actions. The woman, holding the toy in her hands, looked at the maid with an icy expression and commanded her in a commanding tone to immediately go and show the gifts that the other cults had sent as a sign of respect, forcing her to act without further questions or hesitation. When the girl said that the elixirs she had given were for the little lady, the woman angrily slammed the table and said that she would need these elixirs much more than a child who did not really understand anything about martial arts and was not able to use them. Carefully placing the baby on soft pillows, the maid lovingly arranged her in a comfortable position and then quietly promised that she would soon bring the long-awaited gifts that were so revered and expected in other cultures, without wasting a minute to think. Chung Lihua began to cry loudly as she was carefully placed on the pillows. The pain was so unbearable that the maid felt the woman's hands tremble slightly because she could do nothing to ease the child's suffering at that moment. Once again, carefully taking the young lady in her arms, So Ren looked at her with concern, feeling that something was wrong, because the little one seemed much weaker than usual. And so Ren began to worry that she was not feeling well, and her condition had worsened. Noticing the blue spots on the baby's body, the maid asked her mistress with slight displeasure and concern what had happened to her, but she only coldly pinched the child and replied with an indifferent smile that her daughter simply did not listen, and there was nothing wrong with that. So Ren, unable to contain her indignation, declared with fury in her voice that the young Chung Li Hua was the daughter of the head of the cult, and therefore she should certainly be shown respect, because, in her opinion, no one could leave the maiden without due attention. The lady replied with cold calm and slight contempt that no one would believe her about who was the servant and who was the mistress, because in this world, rarely is anyone able to see the truth behind the shell that hides the true essence. The woman was the daughter of the Lord of the North. Her name was Bin Yoon Sol. She was rich and noble, possessing not only the magnificence of her family, but also a high position among other influential families, which made the fragile female figure special in society. Living near the sea, on an icy mountain, she maintained good relations with the neighboring clan, constantly strengthening her ties with them, which allowed her to maintain harmony in relations and be confident in the political stability of the region. The demonic cult, with its black buildings that stood like dark peaks in the world, and its scarlet flowers that reflected strength and power, became an important element with which the two powerful clans united through a political alliance, hoping to strengthen their power. The little girl wondered in shock how this cold maiden could be her mother, unable to believe that such a strict and distant woman was her real mother, because her image did not match at all with what she imagined. The amazing thing was that this young couple seemed to be in deep agreement and harmony, but at the same time, they were not just partners, but real husband and wife, despite all their mysterious and outwardly cold side. The lady, with a sly smile on her lips, reasoned that she, in general, always liked being pregnant, because in this case the head of the alt often visited her, and she felt important and needed, and his visits filled her life with special meaning. With a cold expression on her face and a cruel grin, Bin Yoon Sol pierced the maid with the child in her arms with her gaze, and said that if this woman disappeared, perhaps the master would start visiting her often again, giving her what she so craved. So Ren took a step back, stepping away from the evil mistress, and feeling the tension building, she quietly apologized for her words and behavior, realizing that her anxiety and fear for her own life and the life of her child were completely justified, because she was afraid that the mistress might harm them. With a sly smile on her face, Bin Yoon Sol said with disdain that it seemed like the maid was taking a long time to understand everything, since she was acting so stupidly and could not understand what was happening around her, causing confusion and irritation in her mistress. Passing by the other servants with an unperturbed expression, the lady resolutely walked away, ordering that the elixirs for her daughter be brought to her as soon as possible. While it was obvious that her concern for her daughter was just a formality, and she did not care about her fate, so Ren hugged the young mistress tighter, silently apologizing for not being able to protect her and for not being able to uphold a woman's honor, feeling deep regret for her helplessness in the face of threats and injustice. The little girl stretched out her hands to the maid, trying to calm her down, because the woman, despite her severity and coldness, was not to blame for what happened, and the girl felt that she should support her in this difficult moment. Chung Li Hua decided for herself that she would destroy her mother for So Ren, destroying her like a fragile mirror, reflecting all the cruelty of her actions, and would act decisively, leaving no chance for forgiveness, becoming more and more confident and cruel. And while the maid was sobbing, holding the baby in her arms, the girl, hiding her feelings, was already making insidious plans to destroy her cruel mother, who was the embodiment of fear and pain for her, and did not leave her any opportunity to harm her again. 2 years passed, and the demon clan continued to build their luxurious buildings in the old Chinese style, with massive columns and intricate ornaments, symbolizing strength and wealth, attracting the admiring glances of everyone who entered these places. Bin Eun Sol sat at the table in the room in a new kimono, her gaze cold and commanding. A maid stood next to her, and opposite, with pride and determination, sat the little mistress, ready for any trials that awaited her. The baby was shivering from the cold. Her small, fragile body could not withstand the freezing heat, and her head was spinning from weakness and fatigue as the cold penetrated every cell of her body, leaving only pain and a feeling of helplessness. So Ren, with a worried voice, asked the lady to stop. But the lady, with a cold smile on her lips, said cruel words that it had to be like this, and continued to use icy cold against her daughter, without showing the slightest regret. Putting her hand to her face, Bin Yoon-sol explained with majestic calm that since she herself was from the Ice Palace, her daughter was obliged to learn to endure the cold, as it was part of her upbringing and a test that was meant to toughen her up. In fact, the woman was deeply upset, because despite the fact that she became stronger and more beautiful from the elixirs, she still could not attract the attention of her master, which left her in a state of bitter disappointment and melancholy, feeling invisible and insignificant. Gritting her teeth angrily, the lady became angry, thinking that if she had not given birth to a child, everything would have been completely different, because then Go Young-ma would have continued to love her and tenderly care for her, and her life would have been full of happiness and harmony. But now everything has changed. The girl, hugging herself with her arms, shivered from the cold, trying to warm up. But the cold penetrated her body, and despite all her efforts, she could not find even a little warmth to get rid of the unbearable pain and fear that gripped her. When Chung Li-hua fainted from the cold, So Ren could not bear it any longer, and, without thinking for a second, rushed to the little lady, hugging her, trying with her warmth to bring the girl back to life, and at least slightly ease her suffering, which was becoming more and more severe. Kneeling down, the maid, with a pleading look, asked her mistress to use her inner magic, her energy, to help her daughter, to heal her and bring her back to life, because she felt how she was losing her with every moment, unable to stop the pain. Casting a cold glance through the mirror at the maid, the lady cruelly replied that her spiritual energy belonged only to her and ordered her to leave immediately, not wanting anyone to dare to disturb her peace and quiet at this moment. So Ren, with pain in her eyes, nodded sadly, not daring to contradict her mistress. Carefully picking up the little girl in her arms, she left the room with a heavy heart, feeling that every step was causing her internal pain. But she could not disobey her orders. Many of the maids laughed and whispered at their partner, who continued to look after the child, who was already 3 years old, but had not even learned to talk, and this gave them a feeling of superiority and fun. So Ren, holding the little girl close to her, silently endured the ridicule and condemnation from the other maids, hiding her pain and disappointment. But deep in her heart, a storm raged, because she could not find a way to help the little girl, trying her best to remain strong. In the warmth, after So Ren had managed to cover the girl, Chung Li-hua quickly came to her senses, opening her large, tired eyes, which, despite the loss of strength, still radiated determination and strength, ready to face any challenges. Together with the maid, they sat in a clearing surrounded by greenery, and around them rose the majestic palace of the cult. And here, in this secluded place, they found a little peace and quiet, resting from the hard everyday life and worries, enjoying the temporary peace. Awkwardly, the girl in the pink kimono with flowers on the fabric, with a feeling of guilt and embarrassment, asked her nanny for forgiveness for being so hard on her, realizing how her behavior could upset the caring woman and hoping for her understanding. The maid, with a soft and warm look, asked the sweet little girl not to say that anymore, and not to blame herself for what was happening, because the girl was not guilty of anything, and she was always there, ready to support and protect, despite any difficulties. So Ren closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and said with a feeling of regret that she should have apologized to the girl, since she had failed to protect her, and now it was important that there were no unnecessary grievances or misunderstandings left between them. Having picked up the baby in her arms, she offered with a kind smile to make a wreath of flowers for her, hoping that this would cheer the girl up a little and brighten up her sadness, making her feel at least a little happy in this world full of cold and cruel trials. Chung Li-hua looked at the nanny's blue fingers, which had become that way due to prolonged exposure to the cold, in confusion, wondering how this unbearable cold could affect a person so much, because for her it was something unknown, strange, and even frightening. So Ren asked the lady not to worry, assuring her that if she moved her fingers a little, they would soon become normal, and the pain and discomfort they felt would eventually disappear, and everything would return to its normal state, as before. Falling back onto the blanket, the little girl sat as if thinking about how it all happened slowly, step by step, and not all at once. But she learned gradually, realizing that the world around her was complex and required time to master, to learn to cope with difficulties. The nanny rushed to hug the girl, saying that she was learning and growing quite quickly, which made her happy, because it was always important for her to see how her pupil was growing, becoming stronger, wiser, and more self-confident, despite all the difficulties. The little girl began to shake her head, quietly saying that she shouldn't have told her daddy that she had already learned to speak, because it was her little secret, which she kept deep in her heart, hoping that no one would find out about it. So Ren offered to go and weave the wreath, while little Chung Li Hua could rest and wait for her here, enjoying the peace and quiet wrapped in the gentle summer warmth, knowing that she would return soon and continue to care for her as always, filling her day with her presence and love. The little girl waved to the maid who went away to get flowers, with a slight feeling of confidence that soon her nanny would return with beautiful, bright flowers to make her a magnificent wreath that would bring her joy, peace, and a sense that there was room for beauty in this world. In public, Chung Li Hua pretended that she couldn't speak and could only crawl, not letting anyone know how smart and capable she was, hiding her potential in order to stay in the shadows and not attract unnecessary attention. Clenching her fist in front of her in anger, the sweet little girl firmly decided that she would first run away to help the nanny, and then, after some time, she would take revenge on her evil mother for all the suffering she had caused her and for all her cold behavior. As soon as Chung Li Hua heard a strange, barely audible noise coming from the bushes, her wary eyes quickly turned back, trying to discern the source of this sound, suddenly overwhelmed by anxiety and curiosity, while her heart began to beat faster. The little girl tilted her head to the side in surprise, wondering if she was imagining things and wondering if perhaps someone was secretly watching her, because she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed imperceptibly in the surrounding silence and forest setting. Deciding that it was all just a figment of her imagination, she returned to picking flowers for So Ren, absorbed in the pleasant occupation, when suddenly an unknown shadow, a tall silhouette, unexpectedly appeared from behind the bushes, asking what she was doing here alone, among these green spaces. It was Ak Wu Ran, who had matured considerably since the last time they met, and had become even more handsome. His purple ribbon tied tightly in his long, wavy dark hair, and his elegant hanfu with purple patterns, added a mysterious air to his appearance. Chung Li Hua greeted the young man with a bright smile, tenderly pressing a fragile flower to her chest, which seemed to be the embodiment of her feelings, and her eyes sparkled with happiness, as if reflecting the light, and sincere joy, filled with tenderness and warmth, played on her face. The girl handed the plant to the boy, as if she were giving him a piece of her soul, full of unspoken feelings, hoping that he would not only accept this small but very significant gesture, which for her became an expression of her most sincere intentions. Ak Wu Ran couldn't quite tell if that was the moment when she gave him the flower, but her gaze suddenly fell on his calm face, which, despite its outward calm, seemed to be hiding something important and deeply personal. The girl began to nod her head and mumble the word flower, trying to convey her feelings, but her voice sounded so quiet and uncertain that it seemed that she herself could not understand what exactly she was trying to express, creating the impression of complete confusion. Kneeling down next to the clan chief's daughter, the young man carefully watched her reaction and realized that she probably understood something of what he was saying, and Chung Li Hua realized with horror that she had accidentally revealed her true identity, giving herself away. Ak Wu Ran frowned suspiciously and said that she had heard rumors from the servants that she could neither speak nor walk, and her words were filled with a malevolent interest in her weaknesses, clearly hinting at her vulnerability. Chung Li Hua began to justify herself to the young man, playing dumb as if she didn't understand what he was talking about, trying to hide her real intentions and cling to the role of a naive girl in order to avoid further suspicion and not get into trouble. Seeing the butterfly, she could not resist and began to carefully crawl after it, not paying attention to the boy's intent gaze, who was watching her every move, clearly interested in her strange behavior and involuntary playfulness. Pointing her finger forward, Akwu Ran said that there was an insect in the distance, directing everyone's attention to that direction as if it was an important discovery, drawing attention to what was happening around them as if it could be something significant. The girl, hearing her words, immediately galloped forward, trying to get as far away from the young man as possible, as if this could help her hide from his intense gaze, which seemed too penetrating, and get rid of all the awkwardness of this situation, which was becoming more and more tense. Realizing that Chung Li-hua was quite capable of standing on her own 2 feet, and that the rumors that had been circulating about her were nothing more than lies, the boy rose to his feet with some surprise, and with a deep sigh, realized that he had been wrong in his assumptions about her. After that, standing up firmly and casting a determined glance in her direction, he said that in fact the little girl was not stupid at all, and his words sounded with complete conviction, as if he had just discovered the true nature of the girl who had surprised him, not wanting to show her true powers any longer, and trying to hide them from prying eyes. The girl, pretending to be a naive and carefree child, suddenly sank down onto the soft green grass, as if she could not stand, and accidentally lost her balance. Suddenly, the young man quickly grabbed her hand, his gaze involuntarily fixed on her skin. Something, completely unnoticeable to those around him, attracted his attention, and he began to carefully study this small and, perhaps, important moment for him. Her tiny fingers, like fragile flowers, lay in his large and strong palm, as if she were holding something incredibly valuable and fragile that could disappear in an instant if it were not surrounded by his careful care. Noticing that her skin was unusually cold and slightly pale, Ak Woo Ron quietly said that he had heard about how her mother had begun to visit her daughter frequently, testing her ice magic on her, seeking to use her powers for her own unknown purposes. The young man, feeling worried about the girl, gently hugged her, trying to surround her with his warmth and care, wanting to convey to her at least a part of his warmth so that she would feel more protected and calm at that moment. The little girl, confused and upset, pressed herself even closer to her interlocutor. Her heart sought consolation, and she found comfort in his warmth, feeling safe, as if in the arms of a loved one. Ak Woo Ron, seeing how cold she was and how she was shivering, decided to use his magic to warm the little girl. His hands radiated warmth, and with every movement he filled her space with comfort and warmth, absorbing her cold. The young man smiled cruelly, and his words, like sharp, icy needles, pierced the girl's heart, leaving her in complete horror as she felt fear instantly grip her, like an icy wind running down her entire back, making her tremble. The girl shuddered at the sound of such cruel words, and a feeling of fear, like a cold wave, swept over her, causing her body to tense up and her thoughts to become confused as she began to desperately try to break free from the strong hands of this cruel scoundrel. The attacker only chuckled, watching her struggle, and despite her attempts to break free, continued to hold her, feeling how much strength was hidden in her fragile body, which only gave him satisfaction and increased his gloating. Chung Li-hua growled angrily, feeling the anger burning inside her even more as she realized that the young man was not just watching her suffer, but was also enjoying it, savoring every second of her pain just as he had once experienced it himself. And this thought made her even more angry. Grabbing the guy's face with strong fingers and pulling him towards herself with the intention of punishing him for his insolence, she was ready to say something sarcastic, but at the last moment, giving in to a sudden impulse, instead of words, she gave him a kiss full of rage, passion, and frightening tenderness. Ak Woo Ron immediately pulled back, abruptly breaking this strange, stunning moment, and, feeling his heart beating at a crazy rhythm, took a few steps away, trying to comprehend what was happening, and at the same time, not let himself succumb to her unexpected closeness again. The guy jumped to his feet so abruptly that Chung Li-hua, who had not expected such a lightning-fast reaction, lost her balance. Her body swayed dangerously, and her hands instinctively darted to the side in search of support. But there was only air around, and the next moment she almost fell. Ak Wuran looked at the girl with undisguised hatred and disgust, and then, feeling the unpleasant warmth of her touch on his lips, he quickly began to furiously wipe his face with the sleeve of his hanfu, as if trying to erase not only the kiss, but also the very memory of this unexpected moment. The girl, still sitting on the spread-out blanket, suddenly realized with icy horror that she had made a huge mistake, that her action was not just awkward, but wrong, impermissible, unacceptable, and now she did not know how to fix it. In the original, Chung Li Hua always had deep and sincere feelings for the main character, who was not only an outstanding warrior, but also a sword master with unwavering strength, nobility, and an indomitable spirit, which made him an ideal in her eyes. Of course, the young man, possessing a sense of duty and honor, pushed her away, because she not only belonged to a hostile clan, but was also the daughter of the head of a demonic clan, as well as the heiress of his mentor. And this made their relationship impossible, unacceptable, forbidden for him. Enraged by the refusal, the girl flared up with anger and decided that, no matter what, she would win the young man's favor at all costs, break his resistance, and make him see in her not only the daughter of an enemy, but also a worthy companion whom he would not be able to reject. Cunning and wily as a fox, she, driven by her obsession, resorted to the most sophisticated way to win his heart. She used a love potion, hoping that it would deprive him of his will, make him lose control and conquer his mind and body, opening the way to the desired union for her. But in the end, she met her tragic fate, and the one she so desperately wanted to conquer became her destroyer. Her hands, once clinging to life and love, now lay on the ground, covered in blood, motionless, lifeless, like a sad tribute to her mistakes. With childish horror, the little girl suddenly realized something frightening. She had taken away the boy's first kiss, without even realizing it at the time, because she herself was only 3 years old then, and now, remembering that moment, she felt her heart squeeze with inexplicable shame. The maids, standing by the pond, where delicate lotus petals swayed lazily on the water, were once again discussing the recent scandal, whispering among themselves that the mistress had once again thrown a bottle with the remains of wine at her tiny daughter in a rage. At the same time, Chung Li Hua, dressed in a new pink kimono, sat in the shade of the trees behind the pond, absent-mindedly playing with toys. But despite her apparent carelessness, every word the maids said reached her ears, and she listened to them as if absorbing the poison that was slowly penetrating her soul. Ak Wu Ran, having found her among the trees, came closer and, without changing the calm, almost detached expression on his face, quietly asked a question in which there was a barely perceptible concern. What was she doing here alone again? Why had she come again to this place where she should not have been? Irritated, without even looking at him, Chung Li Hua waved her hand impatiently, as if silently ordering him to go away, not to disturb her, not to block the sun with his presence, because his shadow fell right on her and her mood was too bad. However, the young man did not retreat, but only gloomily changed the subject of the conversation. His face remained calm, as if carved from marble, and in the depths of his dark, deep eyes, a certain cold detachment was reflected, and with each passing moment they seemed more and more beautiful to her. Kneeling down next to the little lady, the young man quietly but confidently asked her to extend her hands to him, promising that if she allowed it, he would be able to warm them with his warmth. But the little girl stubbornly refused, looking away and clenching her fists, as if she was afraid to trust the touch. After a few moments of hesitation and reflection, she timidly placed her tiny hand in his outstretched one, and almost immediately the icy cold that had gripped her fingers began to recede, dissolving under the soft, enveloping warmth that he transmitted to her without saying a word. Ak Wu Ran looked at her pale, cold fingers with great concentration, letting his spiritual ki powers flow smoothly through them, filling them with life and warmth. And at that moment, it seemed that he was not just warming her, but also putting something more than simple care into this gesture. With a slight smile, Chung Li Hua tried to convince her companion that he was wrong to sympathize with her, because she was perfectly fine, nothing was bothering her, and she didn't need any pity or protection. But her voice sounded as if she was trying to convince not only him, but herself as well. Abruptly, Almost rudely, Ak Woo Ron pulled his hand back, as if suddenly realizing that he was going too far, and frowning at her, he coldly said that he didn't feel sorry for her at all, that he didn't care about her at all, trying to act distant, as if it was actually true, hitting himself in the chest with his palm, as if trying to shake himself and drive unnecessary thoughts out of his head. He jumped to his feet and defiantly shouted that such a feeling as pity was completely alien to him, that he had never experienced it and was not going to start now. After these words, he instantly pushed off the ground, soared into the air, and deftly pushing off from the first branch, began to move rapidly along the treetops, easily jumping from one to another, slipping further and further away, leaving the little girl behind. Then, suddenly, Soren finally returned, holding in her hands a delicately woven wreath of fresh flowers, so beautifully chosen for the little lady, so that they would highlight her innocent, fragile beauty and add a little bright color to her face. The little girl, noticing the returning maid, quickly asked her to put this wreath on her head as soon as possible, because she was sure that such beautiful flowers would be able to complement her image, giving her even more charm and tenderness, so characteristic of her age. Chung Li Hua looked truly gorgeous, with the wreath that adorned her hair, and her kimono, with its soft pastel shades, perfectly matched this wonderful accessory, giving her an air of ethereal beauty and cuteness that one could only admire endlessly. The little girl suddenly became alert, and turning to the side, caught a strange sound that had gone unnoticed by her before, and now she could not understand what it was. A barely audible rustling or some kind of unclear rustling coming from somewhere nearby. So Ren gently picked up the baby, holding her close with tenderness, and looking at her with a kind expression, said that it was time to get ready for bed. At that moment, she softly felt that the cozy evening had already arrived, and it was time to go to the world of dreams. They walked back to the palace, heading towards their home, located in the very center of the clan of demonic creatures, where not only peace and protection awaited them, but also many hidden threats that seemed to always be in the shadows of their lives, waiting unnoticed. However, they did not notice that in the thick and dark bushes nearby, there was a man hiding, his eyes, full of mysterious and cold interest, watching them, as if he knew something important that could change their destinies, and his attention was directed only at them. The entire crowd of people watched the young lady attentively, admiring her exquisite beauty, which became brighter and brighter every day, and their eyes reflected genuine, enthusiastic pride, because her charm captivated everyone without exception. The man, with a sharp and angry expression on his face, shouted at his interlocutor for the noise, because he knew very well how sensitive the little lady was, and how the slightest sound could disturb her peace, upsetting her fragile balance. The old man muttered with difficulty, noting that the young Chung Li Hua was an incredibly talented child, as only a gifted person like her would be able to notice their presence, possessing an astonishing strength that amazed even the most experienced. Ak Woo Ron was kneeling among the other adults, who were discussing what was happening, arguing with each other with anger and irritation, worried about the little girl who was dressed in winter clothes, despite the fact that it was a hot summer outside, and her strange outfit immediately attracted attention. One of the men, concerned about the girl's condition, decided to approach Ak Woo Ron, anxiously asking if their dear Chung Li Hua was ill, which of course frightened the poor young man, causing his heart to clench painfully, because the thought of the girl's illness was unbearable for him. Ak Woo Ron, struggling to get up and feeling the anxiety of those around him weighing on him, looked at the crowd with slight irritation and asked if they were so worried about the girl, why didn't they go and check on the lady themselves? The old man, after thinking for a moment, explained to everyone that their concern was entirely justified, but if they were in the line of sight and were noticed, it could lead to even more trouble since they were being pursued and could not only threaten themselves, but her as well. All 10 demons in question were wanted criminals, and the Alliance had put a large bounty on their capture, which only increased the danger of their presence, as they were not only dangerous to society, but also had extraordinary abilities. The old man in the white hanfu, with a majestic and calm appearance, stood up and said that Chung Li Hua was special because she was the firstborn in the demon clan, and in her body, There was an incredible power of spiritual energy that could become the key to a great future. All of them, not knowing how else to express their affection for her, gave gifts, each of which was valuable in its own way, from fine jewelry to chests of gold coins, and all these gifts were only a small part of their respect for the girl, to whom they all attributed an important role. However, despite all the gifts and the desire to help, they could not approach the girl, and therefore it was decided that Ak Woo Ron, who was always nearby, would watch the lady and, if necessary, help her, protecting her from possible threats. The young man sighed heavily, clutching his head with his hands, his face expressing despair and inner anxiety, because thoughts about what had happened did not leave him, and he tried to figure out what was going on in his head, feeling how the feelings of anxiety were growing. He was surrounded by demons, their bright red eyes watching him closely, and without hiding their persistence, they asked if everything was okay with the child's body, as if expecting an immediate answer, because the baby's condition was the most important issue for them. Chung Li Hua began to stutter as he recalled his time with the young lady, his thoughts racing in search of answers, and fragments of memories full of the extraordinary beauty and tranquility that he treasured so much appeared in his mind. When he was near her, he felt something strange, as if some invisible power emanated from her, similar to white magic or chi energy, which enveloped him, making his heart beat faster and awakening a strange feeling of peace and anxiety at the same time. The baby was the daughter of his enemy, and for that reason, he shouldn't get attached to her, because it could lead to even more complications in their relationship and jeopardize everything he was trying to build. But the young man's heart told him otherwise. But the little girl was not to blame for what happened. She was just reaching for the hanfu, the hem of which was her father. But he, instead of comforting her, ignored her attempts, as if not noticing her pain, which only increased her loneliness. What alarmed him most were her words, in which she asked that no one feel sorry for her, assuring everyone that she was fine, although it was clear from her face that this mask of self-confidence hid something much more disturbing and painful. Not receiving an answer, the demons, not hiding their excitement, shouted at the young man, asking what happened to the baby, whether she was okay, that they were worried about her, and wanted to hear from young Ak Woo Ron at least some confirmation of her condition. With his head down and unable to hide his worry, Ak Woo Ron replied that the girl was fine. She was alive and well, but his words failed to dispel the worry in his own heart, as he felt that there was more to the truth behind that simple answer. The young man stood up with a determined expression, and, loudly declaring that he had decided to begin cultivation behind closed doors, he left, his steps sounding firm, as a symbol that he wanted to leave everything behind and immerse himself in the world of practice, removing himself from external worries and concerns. The demons who watched him leave decided not to interfere and continued their conversations, but curiously asked when the boy would begin his cultivation, as it was an important event that attracted their attention and caused some wariness. Ak Woo Ron, turning around, with his long hair fluttering in the wind, replied briefly that from tomorrow morning he would go into seclusion, where he could concentrate on his practice in search of inner peace and harmony, without being distracted by external stimuli. The men standing to the side were shocked at how quickly the boy decided to begin his cultivation, and in such solitude, as it meant that his path to cultivation would be hidden from everyone, and he himself would become increasingly inaccessible to the outside world. The boy, closing his eyes, hoped that if he could not see his mistress, then his feelings for her, so tender and complex, would also disappear, like the fog disappearing at dawn, and he would finally be able to free himself from this emotional confusion. He was obliged to hate the little girl because her father had killed his parents, and this cruelty could not be forgotten, although he tried to find the strength to forgive. But the pain of loss and the weight of revenge still sat in his heart like an unbearable burden. 2 years had passed, and in this quiet moment, the wind gently touched the field where the closed house stood among the golden waves of wheat, like a symbol of the solitude that Ak Woo Ron had chosen to get rid of everything external and immerse himself in self-knowledge and cultivation. Ak Woo Ron sat on the cold stone floor, his body still and his ki, like invisible energy, swirling around him, creating a calm atmosphere in which he tried to concentrate and achieve inner harmony despite all his internal conflicts. Getting to his feet, he felt confused and depressed, because as soon as he closed his eyes, the image of the little girl, her face and words appeared before him again, that he could not get rid of her presence in his thoughts, despite all his efforts, and this brought him pain and anxiety. With a slow and measured step, he approached the slightly open doors, from which a bright light was shining, and with each step, he felt how he was no longer able to maintain the usual calm that he had cultivated so easily before, but which was now slipping away. The demonic cultivator's palace, despite the many years, had not changed. The majestic towers, built in the ancient Chinese historical style, seemed to be frozen in time, maintaining their grandeur, as if they were part of the universe itself. Go Youngma sat in his office, dressed in a dark hanfu, immersed in reading a scroll that he had carefully placed on his lap, his face showing a complete lack of interest, as his long red hair, tied in a ponytail, fell down to his shoulders. Noticing that the student had approached him, the master spoke with confident words, saying that he had heard the young man, despite his inexperience, go to the meditation chambers, while his steps quietly disappeared behind closed doors. The boy, standing in white robes adorned with a ribbon that hung softly from his hair, suddenly declared with an expression of determination that the young lady was in great danger, and his words, like the tip of a sword, cut through the atmosphere, causing everyone to pay attention. Go Youngma stood there, motionless, his face completely indifferent, as if he was out of this world, but his gaze betrayed a hidden, barely noticeable tension, and the boredom that had previously enveloped him like smoke had now disappeared, giving way to anxiety. The man's hand, squeezing the scroll with such force that the paper was momentarily crumpled, conveyed the full weight of the owner's inner experiences, as if he were trying to hold in his hands something much more fragile than just paper pages. The man stood up from his seat and, with an expression of surprise and displeasure, shouted, not believing his ears, that after Ak Wu Ran had spent 2 long years in meditation, he would come out and first of all tell his mentor such terrible news, full of threats and fears. Go Jung-ma loomed over the boy in a menacing and commanding manner, his figure like a stone wall, but he held back, holding back his rage so as not to cause the boy the slightest harm, despite his inner excitement and irritation. Ak Wu Ran, covered in cold sweat from the fear that had gripped him, squeezed out words that were barely audible, muttering that the danger to the little girl was not outside, as everyone might think, but inside, and his voice trembled, as if every sound was filled with anxiety. The clan leader, feeling growing irritation and deep discontent, squeezed the scroll in his hand with such force that the papers began to crack, and at the same moment, without a second's hesitation, he burned it, leaving only ashes as a visual symbol of his rage and complete indifference to the message. The man, without uttering a single word, walked past his student with the greatest determination, not paying the slightest attention to him, and then abruptly slammed the door, leaving behind him only an empty silence, devoid of any hope of continuing the conversation. Ak Wu Ran breathed out a sigh of relief when Go Jung Ma left, but the feeling of fear still continued to slowly creep up his back, leaving behind a frightening trail, like a dark shadow that was unwilling to let go of him, and his heart beat faster with anxiety. Clutching his head with his hands, the boy was tormented by doubts, wondering if he had done the right thing by telling the guy everything, because he probably didn't care about the fate of the enemy's daughter. But his conscience still couldn't calm down, as if he had violated something important. Looking into the distance, the boy still could not get rid of the thought that the little lady continued to stir his heart, and despite all his efforts to suppress this feeling, his hair, fluttering in the wind, seemed not just a movement, but a part of his restless experiences. The servants in green robes, moving quietly, listened to the strange sounds coming from behind the screen, and all their attention was riveted to this noise, which was becoming louder and louder, creating a feeling that there was anxiety and something threatening in the air. The lady, with a furious crash smashing the elixirs, dropping the glass on the floor with a loud ringing sound, screamed at her daughter, accusing her of making her weaker, and her voice sounded like a thunderclap, filled with rage and hopelessness. The Queen of the North screamed at the servant with fury. Her voice was full of malice and accusations. She did not hesitate to express her displeasure, blaming her for what happened, and in her eyes there was an unbridled rage that left no room for forgiveness. So Ren, fearfully clutching the young lady in her arms, pressed her tighter to herself and anxiously asked her, crying and inconsolable, what she had done wrong, because the answer seemed extremely important to her, and the situation itself was increasingly threatening their safety. The beauty's eyes were colder than ice blocks, sparkling in the frosty light. Their bright blue hue was full of malice, cold as the winter wind, and in their depths there was not a shadow of kindness, only a sharp, piercing feeling of hostility and danger. She suddenly rushed towards the maid with loud cries, her voice full of rage and despair, ordering her daughter to be returned to her immediately, as if that was the only thing that mattered, and her words sounded so imperious that everything around froze with tension and fear. So Ren begged her mistress pitifully, fear reflected in her eyes, asking her to come to her senses and not harm the girl, because she understood that all she could do was try to stop her, but without help, it was impossible to avoid a catastrophe. Smiling like a sinister demon, the woman said that she would not harm the baby, but her words were full of irony and cruelty, after which she again ordered the girl to be returned. Her demand was merciless and filled with dark foreboding. The girl suddenly remembered her past life, when her father also shouted at her mother, brothers and sisters, and she herself, hiding behind the door, watched this with horror, feeling the fear that was eating away at her heart, leaving an indelible mark on her soul. Afraid to step out of the doorway, the girl felt completely helpless and vulnerable, as if her body and mind were paralyzed by fear, not allowing her to take a single step forward, as if the entire room was filled with unbearable pressure. The father then, grinning and clenching his teeth, threatened everyone around him with his merciless gaze, as if his words were a weapon ready to tear apart anyone who dared to object to him, and his every gesture was full of rage and insane strength, which he restrained only by an effort of will. Now her new mother acted as if she was a mirror image of her cruel father, filling every word with arrogance and contempt, claiming that she could defeat any servant like So Ren, and her gaze, full of coldness and bitterness, recalled the horrors of her past. Without thinking twice, the woman suddenly grabbed the girl by the hand, pulling her towards herself with such force that she felt physical pain and fear, as if every movement she made was aimed at suppressing resistance and depriving her of the slightest hope of salvation. The hand gripped the piece of fabric with such force that the fingers dug into her flesh, creating a feeling as if the moment was frozen, and nothing could stop this cruel and inexorable action that left no room for doubt or fear. The little girl was thrown aside. Her body seemed to become heavy, lifeless, and she remained sitting, unable to move, until the maid ran to her in panic, afraid that the cruel act of the mistress would leave a serious mark on the girl. Bin Aeon's soul, who was standing to the side, nervously waved her hand from side to side, trying to express her anxiety and do something. But her efforts seemed useless as the strong blow made her hand hurt, echoing with a sharp pain. Blood began to drip from the girl's nose. Her face quickly turned pale, and she felt a sudden weakness come over her, as if her body was no longer obeying her, and the world around her began to lose clarity, turning into a vague, foggy reality, where every movement was difficult. Chung Li Hua burst into tears, unable to hold back her tears, and so Ren tenderly embraced the poor little lady, feeling her heart ache for this child whose suffering was so obvious, but from whom, strangely enough, there was so little help. The Ice Queen, ignoring the maid's anxious pleas that the little one urgently needed a healer, only stood there coldly, lost in her thoughts, as if her cold heart could not sympathize with this poor creature who was suffering before her. Biting her finger, the woman thought about what to do, because inviting a doctor would raise unnecessary questions from the head of the cult, and although Chung Li Hua was a stupid child, she could not risk her position for the sake of someone so insignificant in her eyes. Leaning her palm on the table, the lady ordered the maid put the girl to bed, assuring her that the next day the little one would feel better, because in her opinion, the only thing needed was a little peace, which would heal her in the same way that it usually happened to others. Through the screen, in a cold and commanding tone, the lady ordered her servant to immediately remove all traces of beatings and blood left in the room, for she knew that not a single hint of the incident should remain, lest those around her suspect anything amiss. Stubbornly folding her arms across her chest, she repeated her order, but, receiving no answer, anxiety began to overcome her, and her wariness began to grow, for the oppressive silence that followed suddenly seemed ominous and uneasy to her. Her eyes widened in horror, and her heart sank for a moment as she realized that something had gone wrong, and instead of the usual servant who was always there, she saw a complete stranger whose presence left no doubt that something was wrong. The servant, bloodied and lifeless, lay on the floor, her body motionless and shapeless, a pitiful reminder of the cruel reality that reigned in this place, where life could end at any moment, leaving only traces of violence. With fear and despair in her voice, the lady screamed, demanding to know who dared to raise a hand against her servant, and, in panic, her gaze turned towards the doorway, hoping that there was not an even greater threat lurking there, ready to strike her. A man's foot, with a heavy and commanding step, stepped onto the floor, and the sound of this step echoed as if it penetrated into the very depths of the room, intensifying the tense atmosphere and causing everything around to freeze, anticipating that something important and inevitable was coming. The lady couldn't help but tremble when she realized that the clan leader himself was standing in front of her. And at that moment, a cold fear ran down her spine, instantly gripping her heart, because she knew that in front of her was a person whose power could not be ignored. Go Youngma walked forward with a firm determination, his footsteps filled with determination and power resounding throughout the room like the muffled blows of a hammer. And in his eyes burned a flame of fury, blinding and merciless, as he was ready to punish anyone who dared to threaten his daughter. His eyes were like abysses, absorbing light. They were black, filled with demonic chi, and around him hovered this deadly, ominous flow of energy, like a dark storm, ready to fall upon all living things, leaving behind only destruction and fear. So Ren, completely overcome with fear, could not help but tremble, her heart pounding in her chest, and her voice breaking as she begged to calm and pacify the mistress's spiritual energy, knowing full well that her power was only causing harm to the little girl. And while the noble lady stood there, paralyzed with horror, unable to utter a word, a man passed by her, and his red hair, like flame, flew through the air, swallowing up the space around him and hiding everything he thought and felt. The little girl, feeling pain in her body and seeing blood, looked at her father in surprise, trying to understand why he was there, what had happened, and why her nose had turned red, and the whole world had started to collapse around her like in a terrible nightmare. As the man, his eyes full of regret and concern, knelt down next to the little girl, his voice became warm and full of apologies. He promised that he would never let her suffer again, for her safety was the most important of all worldly concerns to him. Go Youngma sat next to his daughter with a frown, his mind full of worry and anxiety, afraid that if he made even one extra move, he would hurt her even more, and her fragile body would not be able to withstand the strain. Frustrated and worried at the same time, the man quietly asked his daughter how bad her injury was, and if she really had experienced such pain, because he could feel her suffering reflected in every breath he took, not knowing how to help. The girl, with difficulty turning her head to look at her father, smiled weakly, and, in a quiet voice, reported that she was all right, although her head was still spinning, and it was hard for her to keep herself conscious after everything that had happened. Go Jungma, feeling relieved, slowly rose to his feet, his movements full of tenderness and caution, and, gently picking up the baby in his arms, he took her into his arms, promising to protect her from any pain and fear so that she would feel safe. The little girl could hardly hold back her tears. Her heart was filled with warmth, because for the first time her father treated her so kindly and caringly. His gentle words and actions were like a breath of fresh air in this world full of pain and fear. Casting a furious glance at the woman below, the powerful Go Jung-ma, full of anger and indignation, said with burning fury that it seemed that there was something in his house that was behaving like a wild, ruthless beast, ready to harm his child. The Queen of the North, realizing that her actions had led to this state of affairs, felt the ground slipping out from under her feet, and, sliding to her knees, she screamed in fear, trying to justify herself that all this was just a misunderstanding that should not have happened. With an evil grin, Go Young-ma asked with icy calmness how there could be a misunderstanding when he had witnessed with his own eyes how she, without the slightest regret, treated his daughter like an animal unworthy of respect. Immediately raising her head, the beautiful lady, full of arrogance, reminded him that she was his wife and insisted that he no longer dare to insult her with such words, because in her understanding, her status did not allow such humiliation and neglect. Holding tightly to his baby, Go Young-ma, with a feeling of bitterness and contempt, said that she was worse than any beast, since even the wildest animals have the instinct to protect their children, unlike her, who showed no compassion. The noble lady's hands lay limply by the man's boots, their trembling noticeable even in this tense moment, because she realized that in the eyes of her husband, she had lost all respect, and now her fate depended on his will. The beauty, with tears in her eyes, begged her husband for mercy, promising that she was not guilty of what had happened. She tried to convince him that everything that had happened was the result of a misunderstanding that she could not prevent, but her words no longer sounded so confident. The situation became tense for her, and, unable to bear it, she came up with a cunning plan, pointing her finger at the maid, claiming that she was the one who was causing the girl pain, while she herself was only trying to protect the child from the violence that was happening. The nanny, realizing the gravity of the moment, slowly sank to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks, and she began to justify herself with sincere regret and remorse, claiming that everything was completely different from what her mistress had said. Go Young-ma watched the scene carefully, his gaze cold and impartial, and he slowly said that it was up to him to decide which of the two women could be trusted and whose words were just false excuses and empty accusations. The Queen of the North, feeling a surge of anger within herself, suddenly smiled. Her smile was full of mockery and caustic irony when she, turning to her husband, asked doubtfully where such an interest in his daughter came from. Had he really decided to play the role of a good father? Slowly and with effort rising from the cold stone floor, the lady added with a slight smile and a note of pride in her voice that the most important thing was not that she gave birth to an heir, but that she was initially his wife, and only then did the role of mother come. Placing a trembling hand on her chest, but trying to keep confidence in her voice, the Queen of the North, with her head held high, proclaimed that she was the true ruler of the demonic cult, and no one would dare to dispute her right to this title. However, her speech was suddenly interrupted. The man abruptly cut her off mid-sentence, in a stern, cold tone, declaring that nothing existed anymore, that everything she believed in had sunk into oblivion, and now she would have to face the truth, no matter how cruel it was. The lady, stunned and paralyzed by what she had heard, froze in place, her eyes wide with incomprehension darkened, and her trembling hand instinctively pressed to her chest, as if in a futile attempt to hold on to the elusive reality and protect herself from the inevitable shock. Trembling all over, she tried to object, desperately clinging to the last fragments of hope, because even in the most cruel laws there was no precedent in which a political marriage could be broken so simply, as if it had no meaning, no strength, no destiny. With a mocking and slightly contemptuous smile, Go Young-ma slightly tilted his head to the side, watching his interlocutor, and lazily asked if anyone really seriously believed that he needed someone's approval. After all, he alone ruled this world. He was the arbiter of destinies. Casting a disdainful glance at the ninja bowing before him, the man calmly, without a drop of doubt in his voice, gave the order to immediately convey the news of the divorce to the Ice Palace, and at the same time send something more significant there. The hand of this impudent traitor. The lady in the black mask silently accepted her master's order, without asking unnecessary questions, because the duty of loyalty required from her not words, but unquestioning fulfillment of his every decision, no matter how cruel it was. One merciless, well-honed blow was enough for the cold blade to flare up scarlet, and a thick, heavy smell of fresh blood spread through the frozen air, as if foreshadowing not only the loss of flesh, but also the crushing of the last spark of pride that still smoldered in the soul of the doomed. The fabric of her robe, previously immaculate black, was now marred by a bright red stain that spread down her sleeve, which soon became a meaningless shred. She no longer had an arm, but she stood motionless, her eyes filled with silent horror. The little girl, held tightly in strong arms, shuddered all over. Her large, innocent eyes widened in horror as a picture of cold, merciless cruelty unfolded before her, which she could not yet understand, but already felt with every cell of her being. Go Jung-ma, as if forgetting about everything except the child, began to gently pat her on the back, whispering soothing words, promising that now she was under his protection and no one would hurt her anymore, because from now on he would take care of her as the only true parent. Before leaving the room, the head of the demon cult gave his final order, with icy calm, to lock the unfortunate woman here forever, to give her no water, no food, no medicine, so that her suffering would become the final punishment for her weakness and mistake. The queen, her strength ebbing away with every passing moment, stretched out her weakened hand, desperately begging for mercy, her voice trembling and hot tears of helplessness falling from her eyelashes as she cried out to her daughter, trying to tell her how sorry she was. Drops of fear and remorse were running down her pale, sweat-covered face. She silently moved her lips, hoping that at least the little girl's gaze would tell her that she was heard, that she was forgiven. But in response, there was only a heavy, burning silence. Instead of answering, the young lady, as if not noticing the plea, slowly turned around. Her childish face remained calm, almost emotionless, as she called in a quiet but confident voice to her nanny, the kind woman who had looked after her for so many years, and then extended her hand to her. The maid, who had remained kneeling all this time, expressed her sincere gratitude to her mistress, with deep gratitude and trepidation in her voice, bowing her head in a submissive gesture, as if praying to fate for the mercy that illuminated this moment with a gentle light. The Queen of the North was consumed by rage, boiling inside her like a raging fire, because she, wounded and exhausted, was locked in this cold and dark place, left alone, like a prisoner, doomed to curse those who dared to treat her like this. As Go Jung-ma slowly stepped over the threshold and left the room, the heavy door behind him suddenly shook, and with a chilling rustle, it was sealed with scarlet flashes of qi, as if magic itself had sealed it, not allowing anyone to step back. The man, with gentle but firm determination, turned to his little daughter, whom he held in his arms, asking her to ignore her mother's angry cries, because now it was he, and he alone, who was responsible for her, protecting her from any storms of this world. A sunny, sincere smile suddenly blossomed on the little girl's face, and looking at her father, with eyes full of trust, she nodded without hesitation, as if taking his words to heart, finding in them the comfort and protection that she so needed. The man strode confidently down the long corridor of the estate, his footsteps echoing dully among the massive wooden walls, decorated with carved patterns, and sturdy railings made of dark, varnished wood stretched along the path, giving the place a solemnity. Alarming cries, full of fear and anger, echoed throughout the palace, bouncing off the majestic walls, and the three men standing near the lifeless body could not contain their indignation, because the body of this little girl was covered in many bruises. The crowd of elders gathered around the bed, where the girl lay, silently looked at each other with concern, because her condition was worrying, and their gazes were full of expectation and doubt. The old man, whose trembling hand was still gently squeezing the little girl's palm, said with deep sadness that she had had an abnormality in the flow of qi since birth, and it was because of this that her fragile body suffered so much, unable to withstand the pain that tormented her from within. As one of the warriors furrowed his brows and confidently said that Akwu Ran had previously assured them that there could be no problems with the young lady, another person suddenly appeared behind him like a shadow, his presence causing the air in the hall to thicken. As soon as the newcomer stepped over the threshold, all those present, without a moment's hesitation, bowed their heads before him in deep respect, because before them stood the leader of the clan himself, who had come here to make sure that everything was all right with his precious daughter. Chung Li Hua, weakened and exhausted by illness, lay on a wide bed, sinking into soft pillows, and her face, flushed from the heat, seemed red hot, as if a flame was blazing in her body, sucking the strength out of her, leaving only powerlessness and heaviness. The father was filled with rage, his anger burning like an uncontrollable fire against his daughter's mother, who had treated her so cruelly, and seeing no other way to take revenge, he gave the order in a cold voice to cut off the woman's remaining limbs. The handsome man, without closing his eyes until late at night, dressed himself in an elegant snow-white hanfu, and then, remaining motionless, with an imperturbable face, sat next to the girl, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, carefully checking her breathing, her pulse, monitoring her weak condition. Suddenly, the silence that had enveloped the hall was broken by approaching footsteps, and soon the figure of a young man appeared in the doorway. A student who had arrived here at the call of his mentor. His face expressed concern, and his movements betrayed hidden anxiety. Go Young-ma, continuing to sit quietly, without changing his posture or taking his eyes off the girl, spoke in a calm but reproachful voice, stating that Ok Woo-ran knew the whole truth about how the Queen of the North had abused her own daughter, but chose to remain silent, turning a blind eye to her suffering. Earlier, this same boy had come to his mentor himself, overcoming fear and doubt, and with a trembling voice told him that his little daughter was in terrible danger, desperately hoping that his words would force someone to intervene before it was too late. The girl was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with difficulty, and feverish red spots were burning on her face. Her cheeks were burning like hot coals. Her temperature was rapidly rising, leaving her without strength, in a state of unconsciousness. The man finally admitted what he had always known. The boy had not possessed demonic energy since birth, but was only endowed with a pure, untainted flow of qi, and these words sounded like a bolt from the blue, causing the boy to flinch. The young man lowered his head and tried to hide the fear that gripped his heart, because he knew that being weak and useless meant becoming a vulnerable spot for the entire clan, and he was afraid that at any moment the mentor would consider him a burden and would take his life without hesitation. Go Jung-ma stood up abruptly. His movements were swift, and his voice was firm and commanding, as he declared that Ok Woo-ran was the only person who could save his daughter at this moment, and it was up to him whether she would survive or perish forever in the arms of the disease. The man, without giving the young man a second to think, coldly ordered him to immediately help his little girl, declaring that if he succeeded, he would grant him mercy, but if he refused or failed, his life would end here and now. The young man looked away, his fingers trembling slightly, but he could not disobey. He could not rebel against his mentor, because his will was unshakable and his power was indisputable, and therefore the only thing left was to obey, even if fear squeezed his heart with an icy hand. Ok Woo-ran, raising his head and looking closely at his target, said that the first thing he needed to do was cleanse the baby's blood vessels of accumulated toxins, and for this he needed a heavenly elixir that could restore her strength and health, allowing her to breathe deeply again. He knew that only through this incredible drink could Chung Li Hua regain her strength, restore her qi balance, and recapture the vital energy that allowed her to be not just a survivor, but a determined, strong individual ready to fight. Go Young-ma, seeing Ok Woo-ran's determination and feeling the weight of responsibility, smiled, and without hesitation gave his disciple permission to do whatever was necessary, confident that he would take on the entire burden and do everything to save his daughter. Ok Woo-ran nodded deeply, bowing his head in respect and gratitude to his mentor, his gaze hidden under half-closed eyelids, but the sincerity and gratitude in his eyes left no doubt about his willingness to complete the task at any cost. When the heavenly elixir was used and the restoration process began, the young man intended to repay his debt to the girl, and together with her, they would go through this difficult path, from which, perhaps, they would emerge even stronger and wiser, ready to face any difficulties. Chung Li Hua, lying in bed, covered in sweat and shivering from the cold, felt pain piercing through her body, and the deviation of qi continued to squeeze her consciousness in an iron grip, leaving her with only a painful feeling of helplessness and melancholy. The man gently placed his palm on his daughter's forehead, trying to feel her temperature, hoping that his warm touch would at least slightly ease the heat that tormented her body and bring at least a drop of relief in this difficult moment. Her father, unable to tear himself away from her bed, continued to sit next to her, his eyes full of care and concern, his every movement filled with the desire to do everything possible to ease her suffering without leaving her alone. As he stood up, deciding that he must move away a little, his hand was seized by the small, weak hand of his daughter, who, barely opening her eyes, with a helpless look, whispered, begging him to stay, not letting him go, as if her life depended on it. The girl, holding back tears, confessed to her father that she was very cold, and her voice, full of pain and despair, sounded like a desperate call that deeply wounded his soul, because he could not provide her with the warmth that she so needed. Calmly, with a soft and confident voice, Go Young-ma asked his little daughter to be patient for a little while, promising that once she woke up, she would feel better and her body would warm up, that the illness would gradually go away, leaving her safe and at peace. The man turned and said that he could not fulfill his daughter's request to stay with her longer, his voice full of pain, as he himself wanted to be there, but knew that he had to do otherwise for her safety and future. Turning around, Go Young-ma explained with a heavy sigh that it was not because he hated his daughter, but because his hands were too dirty to touch her, and he could not allow himself to violate her purity and innocence. He felt that he had no right to hold her hand, because of his actions she could get into danger, and strangers could reach out to her, trying to steal her away, not knowing her true value and innocence. Chung Li-hua was such a naive and pure girl. Her eyes were full of trust, and she looked at him with a look that could melt the heart of any adult. So sincerely and helplessly did she need his protection. Sitting down again next to his daughter's bed, he gently asked her to use him to the end, but if he ever became useless and unnecessary to her, she could get rid of him, since his main duty was her well-being and happiness. The man's hand froze at the little girl's dark hair, and he did not dare touch her, realizing that his touch could hurt her or leave unwanted marks. But deep down, he desperately wanted to feel her warmth and support. Suddenly, as if sensing his inner struggle, Chung Li-hua grabbed his fingers tightly, unwilling to let go, her small hand full of determination and affection, trying to hold on to him as if her life depended on his presence and care. Holding her father's hand close to her, the little girl quietly said that everything was fine and that she was glad Go Jung-ma was there, her words full of gratitude and trust that warmed his soul, giving him the strength to continue fighting for her health. In the end, the father, despite his inner doubts, fulfilled his daughter's request, staying by her side until she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, which brought her at least a little peace and rest after all the suffering she had endured. When Chung Li-hua next opened her eyes, her gaze was dazzlingly beautiful and clear. Her eyes were shining with a bright blue light, and she was healthy, free from fear and pain, as if all her troubles had gone away, along with that long night's ordeal. Waking up, she stretched her arms up, enjoying the morning stretch, as if her body was regaining strength and confidence, awakening within itself an energy that had been hidden until then, as if she felt her new charge of life for the first time. Suddenly, Chung Li-hua realized that her strength had been restored, and she began to perceive the world around her in a completely different way. She could now clearly see those small details that had previously escaped her gaze, as if her perception had expanded. Now she could see the tiny particles of dust floating in the air, seeming to dance in the sunlight, as if they had become visible through her new perception, as if she were realizing for the first time the beauty of the world around her. Rubbing her eyes with her hand, Chung Li-hua suddenly realized that her vision had improved much more than she could have imagined. Everything around her had become brighter, clearer, and she could clearly distinguish even the smallest details that had previously remained invisible to her. So Ren, the maid, entered the room with a tray in her hands. With a relieved expression on her face, she happily announced that the little mistress had finally woken up. Her voice was full of happiness, and her tone clearly showed the joy that everything that seemed endless had finally ended. Kneeling down next to the girl's bed, The maid began to carefully ask if everything was okay. If there was any pain, her voice was full of care and tenderness, because she could not help but worry about the health of her mistress, who had suffered for so long. The maid could not hold back her tears. Her eyes were filled with bitterness, and, hiding her face in her hands, she said how worried she was about her lady's health. Her words were full of sincere love and care, because she was ready to do anything to keep her safe. The woman, concerned about her mistress's well-being, demanded that she always remain safe, even if So-Ren herself was at risk. Her voice was stern, but there was such strong affection in it that it was hard to believe that she was just a servant. Chung Li-hua, feeling responsible for her maid, apologized for causing the maid to worry, and covering her mouth with her hands, she suddenly realized that her childish babble had changed, and she began to speak much more clearly and confidently than before, as if her words had become filled with new meaning. When the lady asked why her speech had improved so quickly, So-Ren turned to her and replied with a slight smile that such changes often happened to children when they began to recover from an illness, and that it was a completely natural process that could not be explained otherwise. The maid held a plate of porridge in her hands, which she handed to the little girl, hoping that this small but nutritious meal would give her strength and restore her energy so that the girl could continue to recover and feel better than before. Half-consciously, with difficulty opening her mouth, Chung Li-hua allowed the maid to bring the spoon with porridge closer to her lips, feeling how her body gradually responded to the care and attention, and her strength began to return, filling her body with warmth and comfort. When Chung Li-hua asked what happened to her evil mother after she was injured, So-Ren hesitated. Her face became a little pale, and she remained silent, not knowing how to answer correctly, because this question touched on a very delicate topic that she did not want to talk about. Deciding to change the subject and lighten the atmosphere, the maid smiled awkwardly, stood up, and, trying to hide her nervous feelings, said that she would go prepare a bath for the mistress so that she could rest and her body would recover faster. Chung Li-hua silently realized that her mother was dead, and everything that was happening was a result of her own bad deeds and what she could not change in her life, now realizing the full weight of her past and wrong decisions. Previously, the girl, filled with hatred and rage, dreamed of the death of her cruel mother. But now, looking back on all the events, she did not feel joy or relief from this, but only emptiness and confusion, as if something important was missing. The hot bath filled with steam, rose petals, and white curtains created an atmosphere of comfort and peace. But Chung Li-hua herself, being in front of this comfort, still felt a strange uneasiness, unsure of how her body would react to such a change. Chung Li-hua was afraid to enter the bathroom, feeling like the water would be too hot, and her doubts grew with every thought about how she would be able to withstand the heat without hurting herself, anxiously wondering if she would be able to feel safe. When So-Ren told the little girl not to worry and to go calmly to the bathroom, assuring her that she would not get burned, Chung Li-hua was surprised and asked why the maid was so sure, because she thought that such hot water could not be avoided without consequences. With her hands folded in front of her, the maid tried to change the subject, assuring her that worrying about her mistress was her main occupation, and that she would always be there, ready to take care of her, as befits a true maid, attached to her long service. Frozen in place by the water, the little girl thought about the nanny's behavior, which began to worry her more and more, because it seemed to her that it was too suspicious, as if the maid was hiding something important and did not quite sincerely care about her. The steamy bathtub reflected her blurred face, and the water, spreading, left traces of waves, like an unknown reflection of her soul itself, emphasizing her confusion and the internal struggle that did not give her peace, like a fog filling her thoughts. Clutching her head, Chung Li-hua cried out in panic what had happened to her blue eyes. They had always been dark, and now her new reflection seemed so alien, as if it did not belong to her, like a strange sign of change that she could not come to terms with. The nanny held out in her hands a letter addressed to the master, which had arrived from the northern palace, like some kind of message from fate, concealing within itself important events that were to change everything, and the maid eagerly waited to convey this message, not knowing what awaited her. Go Jungma. After receiving the letter, slowly read the words written in it, and, realizing the meaning of the message, quietly said that he would pay for his actions, giving his life as a terrible price for what was predetermined, as if it were an inevitable duty that he had to fulfill. The head of the cult, with a mocking smile playing on his lips, said that everything that was happening seemed extremely funny to him, and his words sounded like a light, ironic observation, as if he was enjoying it like a spectator in his own comedy. Chung Li Hua was elegantly dressed in a new kimono, with bows neatly tied in her hair, and looked curiously at her new eye color, which now sparkled with a bright blue hue, like a reflection of the sky, giving her appearance a special mystery. The girl stood next to the ancient mirror, carefully examining her reflection, and wondered if it was possible that her appearance had changed so much because of the strange drugs she had recently been given, because she could not understand. When the maids entered the room, Chung Li-hua greeted them warmly, but noticed that they looked indifferent in response, their faces expressing a complete lack of interest, as if it was just another day that brought no joy or excitement to their lives. One of the maids, kneeling before the lady, respectfully explained that she had come to do her duty, clean the room and wash the floors, and her words sounded so calm and confident that it even seemed as if this was her permanent task. The little girl tried to start a conversation with the girl, carefully asking if she had eaten, but the maid, not wanting to waste time on a long conversation, answered with a short yes, slightly avoiding further questions, and clearly not wanting to go deeper into the conversation, which was noticeable. Chung Li-hua smiled awkwardly, feeling her heart squeeze heavily with longing for her nanny, So Ren, with whom she always communicated with such warmth and ease, because they were really close friends, and without her, the world seemed much more empty and lonely. Unable to contain her emotions, she suddenly rushed to the side, cheerfully shouting that she was going to go for a walk, and the maids, although they did not expect such a turn of events, bowed and accepted her decision, obediently agreeing, as always happens in their lives. After Chung Li-hua left, she let out a sigh of relief, as if she had thrown off a heavy burden, and stood for a moment at the door, enjoying the silence that reigned around her, feeling how the tension gradually went away, giving way to calm and ease. The girl walked slowly and thoughtfully along the street. Her small steps were barely noticeable against the backdrop of the noisy city, and each of her steps was so careful and light that it seemed as if the street itself was adjusting to her movement, like a gentle and loving mother. Passing by the Chinese arch with the old brick roof, she looked hopefully for her nanny, So Ren, because for her, So Ren was not just a servant, but a loyal friend and mentor, whose presence always gave her a feeling of safety and comfort. Now, whenever the servants approached her, she felt their respect every time, which was not just a formality, but a sincere recognition of her position, because with each passing day she became more and more important, and her status as a mistress was felt at every step. The little girl stopped not far from the lotuses, her gaze wandering around, and, looking around, she tried to find at least one familiar face among the passers-by that could return her feeling of confidence, as if she was looking for someone who would help her find her way. So Ren walked quickly, confidently, passing through the stone passage, not paying attention to the world around her, as if nothing could distract her from her goal, and the trees along her path seemed like mere decorations, unable to overshadow her determination. And suddenly, like a shadow, a tall man appeared behind the little girl, wearing a long dark hanfu, his black hair tied into a ponytail fluttering in the wind, and his sudden appearance made Chung Li-hua shudder, filling her heart with worry and anxiety. Chung Li-hua jerked back, letting out a cry of fear, her fingers instinctively curling, and her legs retreating back, trying to create distance from the strange and tall stranger who was suddenly so close and bringing a sense of threat into her world. Folding his arms across his chest, the man muttered something angrily, holding back any emotion, and, without bothering to explain his appearance, confidently called himself an ordinary old man passing by who simply happened to be in her path. Chung Li-hua awkwardly scratched the back of her head and, trying to remain calm, said in a reserved tone that if he was not going to leave, she would have to leave herself, not wanting to waste any more time on a strange man who was clearly not who he seemed. The man clearly didn't like her answer, and he raised his voice a little, shouting that he wasn't going to leave and didn't understand at all why he was being asked like that. His words sounded like a challenge, and his pride was hurt by such an attitude towards him. After his scream died down, the man hesitated, realizing his harshness, and began to make excuses, trying to smooth things over. And Chung Li Hua, in turn, realized that her interlocutor was a real sanguine person, energetic but fickle in his emotions. He extended his hand to her, and a red bead flashed on it, looking beautiful and strange against the backdrop of his stern appearance, attracting attention with its unusualness and bright hue, as if ready to tell its own story. Intrigued, Chung Li Hua came closer, carefully examining this gift that seemed to be meant just for her, and her gaze was full of curiosity, because the bead seemed not just a decoration, but something significant, with some special meaning. She asked, puzzled, why he had given it to her, and the man, muttering something unintelligible, explained that he had simply found her, and, deciding that she was worthy, had decided to present this gift to the lady, as if it were the most natural thing to do. Chung Li Hua smiled sweetly, and a blush immediately colored her cheeks as she thanked the man for such an unusual and undoubtedly beautiful gift. Feeling how his attention made her heart beat faster, and she herself felt a little embarrassed and happy. The red bead, although small, was truly lovely. Its light shine sparkled in the sun, attracting the gaze, as if it carried some mysterious power. And Chung Li Hua, as if enchanted, could not take her eyes off this decoration. The strange stranger, noticing her surprise, smiled with a slight mockery and said with some challenge that if anyone dared to offend the little girl, then let her throw this bead at him, and then nothing would help this scoundrel. The man added with a grin that if that happened, there would definitely be an explosion, and everything around would be in ruins, as if his words were not a joke but a warning, and Chung Li Hua felt her anxiety growing with every word he said. Chung Li Hua stood there in complete confusion, not expecting him to give such a strange and disturbing answer. Her heart began to beat faster, and her mind was filled with questions, trying to figure out whether his words were just a joke or if there was actually a threat hidden. Awkwardly, a little embarrassed, she thought that perhaps this uncle was just joking, but it was so strange and unexpected that she held back her anxiety, turning around and trying to distract herself from his strange words, not wanting to seem confused. She nevertheless decided to accept the gift into her hands, feeling in the bead not just an object, but a whole story, giving her warmth, confidence, and a sense of a special connection with this moment. This small gesture became a sign that it is not things that are important, but attention. Having collected an incredibly beautiful bouquet from her garden, filled with the scent of freshness and bright colors, Chung Li Hua easily and excitedly handed it to her uncle, saying that this bouquet was her gift, a symbol of how much she appreciated his care, love, support, and everything that he gave her. The man blushed deeply, not expecting such a touching act from her, his heart literally filled with excitement, joy, and gratitude that she gave him this incredibly sweet gesture that he would remember for the rest of his life. In his hands was a small bouquet, which he held with some awkwardness. His face flushed, and his voice struggled to break through the embarrassment as he quietly muttered that the delicate gift was certainly not suitable for him. But despite this, he could not help but appreciate the sincerity. Without thinking twice, and perhaps under the influence of some obscure impulsiveness, the strange uncle handed her even more red beads, as if they could explain all his mysterious actions and hidden intentions. But she could not fully understand what exactly was meant. After that, as if he had accomplished something important, he quickly turned around, and without further ado, disappeared behind the thick branches of the trees, leaving the girl completely alone, in the shadow of uncertainty, full of questions to which she could not easily find answers. She looked at the strange things he had given her in her hands, puzzled, with a look of confusion, trying to understand what the reason was behind his actions, why he had suddenly decided to give her such mysterious gifts, leaving her completely bewildered. Finally, she found So Ren, holding a wreath decorated with flowers, and, with some surprise, she shouted out that the strange uncle had given her beads, not fully understanding what could be hidden behind this, and how it was connected with her unexpected encounters. The maid standing nearby froze awkwardly when she realized who she was talking about. She realized that Chung Li Hua was talking about a demon, one of those who had once protected the young mistress, and this discovery made her even more wary and worried. The maid, without wasting any time, carefully and thoughtfully helped the little boy put her gifts in a small bag, which she carefully attached to her dress, realizing how important it was to keep this gift and protect it until the situation became clear. And then, carefully taking the girl by the hands, the maid, with a kind smile, suggested that she go and eat, hoping that the food would help her take her mind off everything that was happening and calm her nerves a little after such a strange meeting, gifts, and unexpected events. All this time, watching them leave, another man was watching from behind the bushes with restraint, his presence barely noticeable, but he carefully followed their every step, as if expecting something important or, perhaps, preparing for further action. Meanwhile, the demons had gathered in one room, and one of them, with a bright expression on his face, was clutching the bouquet that the young lady had given him, enjoying this unexpected gesture as a reminder of her kindness, attention, and sincere care. Another, with a sly smile, laughing, pointed his finger at the flower ring that was on her finger, hinting at how she had thought through every moment, drawing attention to her generosity and attention to detail, like a true hostess. The uncle was shocked and could not believe his eyes when he dropped his bouquet, not believing that another man could receive a more valuable and beautiful gift from the little girl, remaining bewildered and confused by such an unexpected turn of events. Grabbing the king of poisons, the man, with a furious expression on his face, began to shake him, asking what he had given the girl that she was honored with a flower ring, and how he had managed to win her attention with such a strange but beautiful gesture. Touched, he began to pick up his bouquet of yellow flowers, realizing that he had given her a gift that was not so sweet and touching that the girl would like it as much as the flower ring, and this made him feel like a loser. Grandfather interrupted their argument by stating firmly that the Northern Kingdom intended to start a war because the tank was not facing them and the king's daughter was killed, which was the catalyst for all of these events, leaving no doubt. The men were not happy because it was the princess of the ice palace who had been the first to do something wrong, hurting their young mistress, and this had created a huge conflict that was now threatening to escalate into something bigger if it was not stopped. The head of the demonic cult made a decision and, without wasting time, went to the village himself to divert attention from his daughter and at the same time greet the townspeople, demonstrating his concern for the people without arousing suspicion. The old man pressed his hand tightly to his belt, carefully looking around at those around him, and with a slight sigh, added that Go Jung Ma, in an attempt to divert attention, behaved as carelessly as possible so that no one would even suspect his true intentions. The adult man in the dark hanfu shrugged his shoulders and waved his hand vaguely, saying with slight surprise that hadn't rumors about the lady spread a month ago, since everyone who should have known was already aware of her true role. The old man, smiling a little mockingly, lowered his voice and noticed that the girl had changed her speech so quickly, becoming much more confident and erudite, that hardly anyone would believe in such a quick and unexpected transformation of her skills. After that, he began to tease the younger demon with a mischievous glint in his eyes, not forgetting to mention that this little girl had given him an incredibly touching gift, a ring made from a flower, which almost made him cry with happiness. After that, they all turned to the king of the dead, with a question about what he gave the girl as a token of gratitude, but the answer was unexpected. The gift turned out to be the only and most significant, because nothing more valuable existed, and everything around seemed only a fake. The elder of the demons, watching what was happening, smiled slyly. His face lit up with a thoughtful expression, and he himself, with a wand in his hands, in gray hair and in light, almost angelic clothes, looked not only wise, but also secretive, like a man who knows all the secrets of the world. Chung Li Hua, sitting by the lotus pond, was quietly lost in thought, dispassionately watching the flowers gently swaying on the water, her gaze lifeless and cold, as if she had lost all interest in life, becoming a part of this secluded corner of nature. She thought about how her eyes were now blue, which was very strange and unusual, and her thoughts couldn't help but go back to when Akwu Ran gave her the elixir. And perhaps it was the reason for the changes, although she still doubted the correctness of her suspicions. But why did the young man, knowing that she was the daughter of his enemy, give her such a drink? Because this elixir was so powerful that it could help him master professional martial arts, making him much stronger and more dangerous than before. Chung Li-hua sighed, realizing that she was indebted to him, as his gift was not a simple gesture, but rather something important and meaningful. And, deciding to thank him, she decided to weave a wreath for him, hoping in this way to at least slightly repay her gratitude. Suddenly, completely unexpectedly, her grandfather appeared right next to her, which greatly frightened the girl because she did not hear his steps and did not expect his appearance. And, with a smile on his face, he told her not to sit on the cold stone, otherwise she might get sick. Picking up the flowers that Chung Li-hua had dropped, the old man gently apologized, noting that he had probably frightened her greatly with his sudden appearance, since his suddenness might have created discomfort in her soul, even if he had not meant to cause her any trouble. Chung Li-hua, smiling slightly, reassured him, saying that everything was fine and that she often got scared over trifles, because her emotional vulnerability sometimes made her too susceptible to any unexpected event. But she was already used to such moments. Stroking the little girl on the head, the grandfather said warmly that at her young age it is normal to feel fear and experience emotions, because this is part of the human experience, allowing one to grow and develop, opening up new horizons in understanding the world. After which he waved his hand, as if brushing away everything that was happening, and asked with concern if she had any pain that he could help with, because he always had the power and knowledge in his hands to cure a wide variety of ailments. Chung Li-hua trustingly extended her hand that was aching, not realizing that her action could cause concern, because she simply wanted the old man to help her with the pain, without thinking about the consequences of such trust. Instantly, the man became serious. His face darkened, and he said gloomily, with a hint of severity in his voice, that one cannot so easily trust strangers, especially those who may not be who they claim to be, because this can lead to undesirable consequences. The little girl still grabbed her grandfather's hand, without taking her eyes off him, and quietly said that she knew she shouldn't trust him like that. But at that moment, she felt like her intuition was telling her that this man wouldn't hurt her, and so she did it anyway. The old man, frowning in confusion, asked why she had done that if she knew how dangerous it was. Because trust is not just a gesture, but a deep feeling that requires awareness of the risks that may be associated with it, especially in such a situation. The girl hesitated. Her gaze became tense, and she could not admit to him that this man was similar to her sweet neighbor grandfather from her past life, who once gave her delicious buns, and therefore it was difficult for her to resist this feeling of trust. So Chung Li-hua smiled sweetly, and, a little embarrassed, said that she really liked this kind grandfather, because he was so caring and considerate that his presence brought her a feeling of warmth and security, as if he was a part of her heart. The old man, slightly embarrassed, hesitated, and felt how this simple confession deeply touched his old heart, because such sincere kindness from this girl was surprisingly close to him, and in her words, he saw something that he had not seen in other people for a long time. Bowing before her with respect and sincere admiration, the demon elder stated that her internal energy had increased significantly despite her not having yet begun to practice martial arts, as the foundations for great potential had already been laid within her soul. Suddenly, the wind, rising as if from nowhere, wrapped itself around the girl's body, and she felt incredibly light and free, as if all the weight of the world had disappeared, and her body began to subtly feel this invisible force that gave her extraordinary freedom. Instructively, Grandpa explained that this was her inner key, the energy that is present in every person, and if she learned to control it by training and refining it, she could use it to achieve great goals and improve her skills every day. Chung Li-hua was overjoyed. Her eyes lit up. She clenched her fists in front of her and, full of determination, made a firm decision to master martial arts and develop her powers as soon as possible in order to become strong and protect those she loves. The old man continued his speech, leaning forward a little, and with a smile full of kindness, He declared that good children like her deserved to be given gifts because they deserved the best, and her sincerity and desire for development could not go unnoticed. He extended his hand to her with an object wrapped in a bright red cloth that caught the eye with its vivid color, and the object itself, at first glance, seemed like an ordinary stick. But Chung Li Hua, feeling the energy, immediately realized that something more significant was hidden inside. Chung Li Hua unwrapped the gift with trepidation, her eyes shining as she saw the ice staff emitting a cold gleam, as if winter itself was trapped within its thin and smooth lines, ready to unfold at any moment. The small hand clutched the staff, feeling the cold flowing across her skin, and the magic emanating from it spread around like thin streams of frosty air, penetrating her body and creating an icy cover that made her feel strong and powerful. Grandpa said with a smile on his face that with this staff she would increase her chi, mastering cold magic, and thus her strength would grow, opening up new horizons in the world of magic, and her energy would become stronger and more controllable. After which he added, pointing his finger at the staff, that if she squeezed it tighter, she would transfer her energy into it, strengthening her magical power, and if she unclenched it, her energy would return back, and the magic would lose its power, maintaining a perfect balance. When the little girl, who was enthusiastically waving a stick in all directions, asked what would happen when she grew up, the old man replied that tens of thousands of blue flowers would appear on her, as if nature itself had decided to give her a miracle that would be impossible to describe in words. Chung Li Hua smiled as she imagined how these flowers would bloom beautifully, and she felt that it would not just be a sight to behold, but real magic that would bloom right before her eyes, creating an atmosphere of a winter fairy tale around her. The old man coughed, grinned, and added mysteriously that the flowers growing from the ice tree are worth more than precious stones, because their beauty and strength are much more valuable than any material goods, and only those who understand their true value are able to appreciate them. The little girl's eyes lit up as she imagined how rich she would become when these wonderful flowers, like gold coins, bloomed and brought her incredible happiness, promising incalculable wealth and prosperity, as if fate itself had decided to generously reward her. Hugging her grandfather and tenderly kissing him on the cheek, the little girl thanked him for such an amazing gift, saying that it was the best, because no other person could give her such a treasure that she could carry with her all her life. The demon elder blushed at her sincere words and smiled, feeling warm satisfaction and joy in his heart, because his attention and care were appreciated, and it brought him no small amount of happiness in his old age. A whole month has passed since then, and the dark sky, covered with thousands of sparkling stars, enveloped the world in its silent grandeur, as if watching how all the events, changes, and experiences follow one another. And life, despite its fragility, continues on its way. The girl sat irritably in her room on her bed in her nightgown, angry that her grandfather's advice, which was supposed to be wise and helpful, did not help her, and she still could not understand why she did not feel strong and confident as she would like. She swung the stick in all directions with great effort, desperately trying to control her internal ki, but despite all her efforts and concentration, she could not feel the slightest connection with this powerful force, and every gesture she made seemed empty and ineffective. Chung Li Hua angrily yelled at the ice staff, demanding that it immediately stop its actions, as she was so tired from the bitter cold that despite her strong desire to hone her fighting skills, she only dreamed of finally falling asleep. The staff made a terrible howling sound, and the ice magic began to rapidly swirl around the girl, as if creating a cold vortex around her, absorbing her powers, and with each passing moment, it became more and more difficult for her to cope with this powerful and uncontrollable magic. The little girl raised her hands in despair, begging the staff to stop absorbing her inner chi, willing to give everything she had, including her bed and pillow, just so that this icy cold that was absorbing her strength would finally stop, giving her a break. Finally, the staff tore itself away from her hand, fell heavily onto the soft bed, leaving behind barely noticeable traces of cold magic, as if its forces were still resisting, not wanting to leave its owner, but still succumbing to the feminine will. The flame flared brightly inside the girl, and she clenched her fists, looking at the sharp stick with burning anger, as if the stick itself was challenging her to a fight, deliberately prodding her into action, as if it was capable of giving her a serious challenge and test. Angrily standing up in bed, she shouted that she would feed the staff with her powers until it would become ill, and its magic would no longer have power over her until the sweet girl learned to control her chi and cope with this difficult test. Sitting down on the edge of the bed with concentration, Chung-Li Hua began to cast a spell, calling upon her inner chi and directing it towards the staff, as if giving it some of her power, hoping that her efforts would be able to break this icy barrier and regain control of the situation. The little girl stood there awkwardly, watching as the branch of the staff, as if possessed by magic, suddenly hunched over and fell silent, as if it had accepted her magic like food, absorbing its power, and seemed to be sated, as if finally satisfied with her efforts. But Chung-Li Hua resolutely refused to give in, her eyes blazing with fierce determination as she screamed that she would continue to feed the staff with her powers until it began to obey her will, causing the magic around her to become more powerful and more controllable. As soon as her words were spoken, her gift glowed a bright blue light, and as if by magic, the staff seemed to obey its owner, its branch bending as if acknowledging her power and willingness to follow her commands, accepting her magic and allowing itself to change. New, beautiful crystal flowers began to bloom on the staff, sparkling like precious stones, giving the impression that the staff itself had begun to flourish thanks to the magic and efforts of Chung-Li Hua, shining in the darkness with its unearthly beauty, as if it had finally awakened from a long slumber. So Ren suddenly entered the girl's room, asking with a slight concern why the mistress was still awake at such a late hour when everyone should have been resting, since it was too late for her usual activities and training, and she clearly looked tired. The girl proudly began to boast to her faithful servant about her achievements, telling how she made flowers bloom on her staff, considering this a real success in her magical efforts, which only strengthened her confidence and gave her strength for new exploits. After which, So Ren carefully put the girl to bed, carefully covering her with a blanket, gently stroked her head, and said that she could continue training tomorrow without worrying about being tired, because rest is also important for success. Bewildered, So Ren asked where the lady was planning to go tomorrow, and for what purpose. Not understanding what could be so important that the girl decided to continue her travels despite all the warnings about the possible consequences. The girl smiled slyly, showed her teeth, confidence flashed in her eyes, and she replied that she needed to pay someone a debt, which in fact hid more complex circumstances that she preferred to remain silent about, hoping for the success of her mission. The next day, the two of them walked through the bamboo forest, the sound of their footsteps lost in the misty morning, until they came to the locked doors of a stone house, where a servant tried to convince her mistress that if they were caught, they would face severe punishment and their plans would be ruined. Chung-Li Hua asked So Ren not to worry, assuring her that she should remain outside while she quickly went inside the house and returned as soon as possible without risking her safety or delaying her duty any longer. The door closed with a quiet creak, and the maid waved goodbye, wishing her mistress good luck, and, slightly out of breath from excitement and anxiety, disappeared into the dark shadow, not expecting that her mistress's mission would be so intense and full of unpredictable events. With small, careful steps, the girl walked forward along the cold stone floor, surrounded by thick fog, where a strange atmosphere reigned, stuffy and damp, creating the feeling that in this place time seemed to have stopped and everything was covered in oblivion. She stomped through the dark and uninviting dungeon, not understanding how anyone could cultivate or improve here, because this place looked so abandoned and strange, as if no one had cared about its contents and condition for a long time. Frustrated, the little girl lowered her head, not knowing where to look for her friend named Ak Wu Ran, because she had completely lost her bearings in this underground, gloomy and confusing place, full of dark corridors, where every step echoed on the walls. Chung-Li Hua instantly turned back towards the voice, her eyes filled with hope, because in this ominous dungeon she had not heard human speech for so long, and now, feeling a growing relief, She looked for a familiar face to get an answer. Ak Woo-ran stood in front of her, wearing a simple old hanfu, his long brown hair falling on his shoulders, and his face was still as handsome, but with obvious bewilderment in his eyes, as he asked what the young lady was doing here. Not understanding the whole situation, water dripped from the ceiling of the dungeon onto the floor. The sound of each drop was almost hypnotic, creating a strange feeling of peace and anxiety at the same time, as if the space of the dungeon itself decided to remind of its ancient, forgotten essence. The boy sat on the floor, deep in meditation, his eyes closed, indicating his concentration, and around him swirled streams of internal ki, filling his body with magical power, reflecting the light from the shadows of this dark dungeon. Ak Woo-ran opened his eyes in surprise and turned around when he heard someone's footsteps. His attention instantly focused on the movement, and he was surprised to see someone enter his dungeon, interrupting his meditation and creating an unexpected moment of tension. It took him only a little time to find his guest, the girl who had decided to visit his cave, and his gaze became more wary, because this unexpected visit seemed strange and completely unexpected to him in such a secluded place. Frowning, the young man asked how the lady got here, and for what reason she decided to be in this ominous place. His voice sounded with slight displeasure, and his eyes showed concern, because he did not expect to see her here. Clutching the bag she had brought with her, Chung Li-hua replied, slightly nervous, that she had walked here on her own 2 feet, not wanting to reveal all the details of her mission, but feeling an inner anxiety that grew with every word. Clutching his head in frustration, Ak Woo-ran muttered that he had meant something completely different, and that the girl shouldn't be in such a dangerous place. His words sounding alarming, as he knew how dangerous it was, here for someone who wasn't prepared for the challenges of the dungeon. The little girl, looking down, quietly said that she knew about all the risks and dangers of this place, but still came here for a short time to give him a gift, and then immediately return, not intending to linger and worry. The young man's face slowly became covered in a dark shadow, his eyebrows furrowed, and his gaze filled with bewilderment. He could not understand what his interlocutor was talking about. Each of her words sounded mysterious, as if hiding something more than a simple meaning. The little girl suddenly tripped over a stone protruding from the ground. Her thin leg trembled, and she, unable to keep her balance, swayed forward, waving her arms in fear, as if hoping to grab hold of an invisible support, but inevitably rushing towards the ground. Chung Li-hua suddenly collapsed onto the cold floor. A sharp pain pierced her forehead like a hot needle, forcing her to close her eyes. And at the same moment, the bag she was carrying slipped from her weakened hands and fell with a dull thud next to her, right at the guy's feet. The little girl slowly rose to her knees. Her thin arms were shaking, her clothes were dirty with earth and covered with small abrasions, and her eyes were filled with anxiety because she looked sadly at her bag, afraid to even imagine that her gift to her friend was now ruined, crumpled. Ak Woo-ran shuddered when his gaze fell on the open bag. His heart momentarily clenched in apprehension, but once he saw what exactly was stored inside, his eyes involuntarily widened in surprise, and he felt a slight thrill. Sweets, cookies, candies, and caramels, which had been inside safe and sound just a few minutes ago, now helplessly scattered across the ground, covered with a thin layer of dust, poured out of the bag, which had burst open when it fell. Confused and confused, the little girl began to collect the scattered sweets in a hurry, deftly sorting through the cookies and candies with her trembling fingers. But each piece, stained with earth, made her feel more and more embarrassed, because she was incredibly ashamed. After a short pause, when the last of the sweets had been collected, Chung Li-hua hesitantly stood up, dusted her palms, looked timidly at the boy standing next to her, and, nevertheless, overcoming her embarrassment, handed him the bag, a pleading look in her eyes, as if asking him not to reject the treat. Ak Woo-ran frowned, his gaze grew colder, and with his arms crossed over his chest, he replied in a reserved but firm manner that during his training to increase his qi, he could only eat certain foods, and not just any food, no matter how delicious or desirable it might seem. Chung Li-hua narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a stubborn line, because she knew very well that the young man had already activated all of his energy points, and therefore he was simply pretending, because in such a state he could easily afford at least a few candies. The handsome man turned away slowly. His movements were smooth, but there was an unmistakable sternness in his voice as he ordered his lady, in a tone that brooked no argument, to return back to the palace, as if the conversation was over and further attempts to argue would be useless. However, the little lady had no intention of giving in. Her eyes flashed with determination, and, overcoming the young man's reluctance, she stubbornly handed him the cookie, hoping that he would soften, take at least one piece, and stop holding up this impregnable wall of self-control in front of her. Ak Woo Ron, without even changing his expression, abruptly put his hand in front of him, as if trying to create an invisible barrier between himself and the treat, making it clear that his decision was final, and any persuasion or attempts to convince him were doomed to failure. Upset, with a slight tremor in her voice, Chung Li Hua looked at the young man and quietly asked if he really thought she had brought him poisoned sweets, and if so, why was he so distrustful of her, as if she might wish him harm? Ak Woo-ran shrugged indifferently, his face unreadable and his voice cold, as he replied that she was allowed to think whatever she wanted, but the decision remained unchanged, after which he turned around and walked away without further ado, clearly not intending to continue the conversation any longer. However, suddenly, the little girl, without thinking, decisively bit off a piece of the cookie to clearly prove that everything was in order with the dessert, and, chewing, she looked proudly at the young man, hoping that now he would stop doubting and accept her sincere treat. After that, as if nothing had happened, she held out the cookie again, her eyes shining with childish spontaneity. In them, one could read the desire to convince him that it was not only completely non-poisonous, but also incredibly tasty, and all she wanted was for him to try at least a piece. Ak Woo-ran exhaled heavily, feeling a strange, unpleasant uneasiness, because he couldn't understand why Chung Li Hua was trying so hard for him when he himself had tried to push her away time and time again. But even despite all his cold refusals, she still remained so stubborn and persistent. The truth was that the heavenly elixir was given only thanks to the young man, and it was this miraculous healing that allowed the little girl to regain her strength, regain her former energy, and once again feel the joy of life, which she had almost forgotten. With unwavering determination, the girl insisted on her own, demanding in a firm voice that Ak Woo-ran finally stop being stubborn, take the cookie and at least try it, because she was trying for him and could not just back down. The young man, after hesitating for only a moment, obediently opened his mouth, allowing his interlocutor to place the sweet treat into his palm, and then, without looking away, carefully brought the cookie to his lips and slowly bit off a piece, tasting it. Feeling how soft and tender the treat was, Ak Woo-ran, slightly embarrassed, turned away to hide his expression and, trying not to reveal his true emotions, began to calmly chew, noting that the food that was so persistently offered to him turned out to be incredibly delicious. Inspired by his reaction, the little girl exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm that if he liked the sweets, she would be happy to bring him more, because she wanted to please him and see how he enjoyed the treat, at least for a moment. However, maintaining his unyielding character, the boy stubbornly frowned and firmly stated that she should not come here anymore, as if he was trying to put an invisible boundary between them. But even in his voice, there was a slight uncertainty. A whole week had passed, and Chung Li Hua was enjoying a leisurely day, sitting with So Ren at an elegant tea table, skillfully carved in the traditional Chinese style. The table was generously laden with a variety of delicacies, among which rice buns were especially notable. The servants, standing a little further away, watched in bewilderment as the young lady carefully placed the tender rice buns into a small cloth bag, instead of enjoying them right then and there, as required by dining etiquette. The woman, squinting slightly and placing her hand to her chin in a thoughtful gesture, slowly noted that the food would undoubtedly get cold on the way, and, perhaps, lose its original tenderness and delicious taste. Wary and obviously upset by these words, Chung Li Hua exclaimed with a bit of alarm that what was said was true, because over time, meat loses its juiciness and becomes tough, which means that the young man to whom she is bringing the treat will not be able to truly enjoy the taste of the dish. So Ren stood up abruptly from the table, loudly slapped her palms on the smooth surface, and indignantly declared that the lady, as far as she remembered, had already taken an oath not to go into the cave where her mysterious friend lived anymore. Clutching her bag of carefully collected food to her chest, Chung Li-hua quietly muttered that of course she would definitely return as soon as she had time to deliver all the food to the one who was waiting for it with anticipation and hope. With her hands on her waist, So Ren sternly declared that the warrior should not be disturbed, as he was cultivating in seclusion, and any interference could ruin his precious practices that required complete concentration and calm. The little girl, noticing the worry in So Ren's eyes, began to appeal to her pity, begging the lady to imagine what it would be like to find herself in such a hopeless situation, without food, in a dark, damp cave, alone with herself, with a hungry soul that longs for at least a drop of comfort. After these words, the little girl, visibly agitated, quickly grabbed the nearest weapon that was lying nearby from the surface and confidently declared that, if necessary, she would be ready to defend her beliefs and her position, despite all the difficulties. The woman, without hesitation, firmly said that Ak Wu Ran could become the heir to their clan, and in order to deserve this title, he had to learn to suppress his emotions and needs, becoming a true man, ready for great responsibility. Chung Li Hua, looking down in confusion, thought in confusion that the boy, her good friend, was completely unwilling to do this, learn this art, and become the heir to the great demon clan, as expected of him. The dream of the young man in the book was to live the simple, unpretentious life of a cattle breeder or farmer, away from the hustle and bustle of the outside world, enjoying the daily joys of working on the land, in harmony with nature, and forgetting about all its difficulties and hardships. Ak Wu Ran would be so happy if he could grow up and become what he always dreamed of being, a man leading a calm and peaceful life, away from the hustle and bustle of unnecessary ambitions, enjoying every moment of his existence. In the end, So Ren, after much thought and internal hesitation, agreed to let the lady go to her friend one last time, realizing that this act could play a decisive role in her future and help resolve the internal contradictions that tormented her soul. Chung Li Hua entered the house, or rather cave, quietly and cautiously, stepping onto the soft floor and moving cautiously into the semi-darkness, when the door, slightly ajar, creaked under her steps, breaking the deathly silence of this secluded, almost holy place. Once inside, Chung Li Hua began to anxiously call out her companion's name, carefully examining every part of the cave, trying to figure out where he could have disappeared to and why he was not around, as if he was deliberately avoiding her, leaving her in the dark and worried. The little girl couldn't understand why she couldn't find the guy, and her heart was squeezed with anxiety because she didn't know what to think. Everything indicated that he might have decided to hide from her, avoiding their meeting, and this increased her anxiety. Deciding that there was no point in continuing the search, the little girl decided to leave the bag of food near the old rock and leave. But suddenly, as if by magic, she heard a faint groan behind her, which made her heart clench with excitement and a premonition of trouble. Worried, Chung Li Hua hurriedly walked around the pillar and looked around to see Ak Wu Ran lying on the ground, engulfed in heat, his skin red and his breathing heavy, as if he was struggling with something that was giving him no peace or strength. Without wasting a minute, the lady rushed to him, sat down next to him, and, pressing his face to hers, anxiously asked what had happened to him, her voice sounding worried, as if she was trying to find an answer to this unexpected and alarming turn of events that had happened to her friend. The handsome man was breathing heavily, his face was distorted with pain, and his eyes were shining with despair. Holding back irritation and fatigue, he finally squeezed out a question about why the girl came to him again, despite his desire to be alone and not bother anyone. Chung Li Hua was not going to back down, insisting that the young man looked extremely ill and that it would be better for him to go with her, since his condition clearly did not allow him to remain in that state, and it was dangerous to go alone. Ak Wu Ran, struggling through the pain, ordered her to leave, claiming that he was fine and that she shouldn't worry. But in reality, he was lying, because his breathing was heavy and his body was hot, which was obvious even in his desperate attempts to hide his true state. Grasping the sleeves of his robe, Chung Li-hua adamantly refused to leave without him, knowing full well that he clearly needed help and that he couldn't stay here alone when his body was fighting something far more dangerous than he was letting on. The young man rather roughly slapped the little girl's helping hand away, causing her to retreat a few steps back, and her heart sank in surprise, as if his gesture was not only a physical, but also a spiritual blow that stunned her and made her feel the full weight of his alienation. Looking at her companion with a hurt expression, Chung Li-hua tightly grabbed her hand, which was hurting from the way he had pushed her away, and with each passing moment, she felt her kind heart begin to break, because she did not understand why her good intentions were so easily rejected. Turning away and trying to hide her emotions, the little girl walked away, deciding that if he did not want her help, she would find someone else who could help him in his trouble, because her conscience did not allow her to simply leave him in such a state without doing anything. Ak Woo-ran, feeling ashamed and inner turmoil, turned away from her, realizing that his actions were not caused by a desire to reject her help, but by deep dissatisfaction with himself. But he remained silent, because he knew that her help might be too great for him. There, on the street, So-ren was already impatiently waiting for the lady, and, noticing her, Chung Li-hua, loudly, with anxiety in her voice, shouted that the guy who remained in the cave urgently needed help, because she could not leave him alone with his suffering. This time, the maid was adamant, firmly stating that it was impossible to help the cultivators during their seclusion, as it was the time for their enlightenment, and any interference could disrupt their deep practices that were important for their future path. After these words, she seized the little girl by the hand, and without giving her any chance to resist, pulled her away, despite all her attempts to resist and not wanting to leave her friend, especially in such a dangerous and secluded place where he could be threatened with great misfortune. So Ren said rudely that of course she felt sorry for the boy, but if he was too weak to endure the trials of life as a cultivator, then it was his fate to die, because he would not be the heir to their cult, and such a fate could not be avoided. Chung Li-hua, unable to contain her emotions, began to cry, trying to justify the young man, claiming that he was simply abandoned without a chance to survive, as if he was destined to die, and everything else was just a cruel game of fate that no one could cope with. The two of them walked slowly away from the cave, their footsteps echoing through the misty forest, and the silence that reigned around them seemed impenetrable, as if nature itself was hiding their actions, not wanting to bear witness to what was happening. Ak Woo-ran lay unconscious on the cold stone floor of the cave, his body as still as marble, while the bag of food left nearby was a reminder of the care he was not destined to receive at this moment, left without help or salvation. A whole week passed. The rain fell tirelessly from the sky, soaking the earth and cutting into the fabric of time, and the majestic Chinese palace of the demonic cult stood motionless, as if waiting for something important to happen in the near future. So Ren, with her hands folded in front of her and a thoughtful expression on her face, asked if the young lady would like to take a walk in the garden, thinking that it might clear her mind a little, forget her worries, and provide at least a little peace in this difficult moment. The little girl stubbornly lay in bed, rejecting offers to play or go for a walk, because the rain outside continued without stopping, and her soul was tormented by resentment towards her friend, who, in her opinion, left the poor boy in such a dangerous situation without any hope of salvation. The lady also responded to the suggestion of playing with beads with a deep sigh, reminding that So-ren had already said that such toys were unsafe because they could explode at any moment, and her concern for the lady's safety was stronger than the desire to entertain her. When asked to bring her some sweets, the girl hid under the blanket, as if in a shelter from the outside world, and, smiling weakly, replied that in fact she would prefer to eat pancakes, because these simple, but such delicious dishes, always gave her a feeling of coziness and comfort. So Ren, hearing her request, clenched her fist in displeasure. Her face became hard, and her voice rang out loudly as she declared that she would definitely prepare food for the mistress, although inwardly she knew that she had much more important things to do than simply satisfy her whims. Chung Li Hua slowly peeked out from under the blanket, cautiously looking around to check if she was alone in the room. Feeling no one else but her own restless mind, she once again became lost in thoughts of what she should do next. After that, she went to the closet, collecting things that could be useful in the future, or perhaps sold to provide herself with at least some financial reserve, because now her life was full of uncertainty and need. Her hand hovered over the crystal flowers in the bag, objects that had once brought joy, but were now simply a reminder of the past she had left behind, and how difficult it was to let go of even such precious memories. She considered for a while whether she should keep the crystal flowers for herself, but soon came to the conclusion that it would be wise to take them with her, because you never know what you might need in the future, especially in such an uncertain situation. Just in case, she decided to create more flowers using her magical power, and within a few moments, crystal plants began to spread throughout the room, as if filling the space with living magic, creating an atmosphere of mystical beauty. Frowning, she continued her work with concentration, putting all her will and magical power into the staff, which in her hands turned into something extraordinary, filling with power, as if coming to life under her touch. Plants, sparkling like ice flowers, wrapped around the stick, creating patterns around it that radiated cold. The air around it was filled with a frosty, almost tangible cold, and the room itself became a place where time seemed to slow down. The flowers fell softly to the floor, as if by themselves, and despite their fragility, they did not break, but remained untouched, as if protected by an invisible force that gave them extraordinary strength, despite their crystalline fragility. Chung Li Hua, looking closely at the jewels that lay at her feet, wondered if they would be enough to get her through all the trials that awaited her, or if she would find herself in a situation where she would need additional support. After making sure that all the necessary things were packed and ready, the lovely Chung Li Hua calmly slung her luggage on her back, feeling the weight of the backpack fill her with determination as she was ready to start her journey and meet her destiny. After looking around and making sure that the street was quiet and no one noticed her, Chung Li Hua carefully walked out the door, not allowing herself to be distracted once again, since every step was important, and she needed to move forward with full determination. After this, feeling that there was less and less time left, the young lady quickly began to move forward, accelerating her steps, realizing that she needed to hurry and check on her friend, because every minute could be decisive for his fate. It was raining, and the little girl, not paying attention to the cold drops, ran quickly along the road into the forest. Her steps were quick and confident, and her heart beat in her chest with increasing anxiety, because she knew that time was running out and that she needed to hurry. Inside the cave, in the shadow of the cold stone walls, Ak Wu Ran sat in the lotus position, meditating intently, absorbed in his thoughts, where every inhalation and exhalation became part of an inner search that he hoped would lead him to the answers he needed and needed. He remembered the words of his birth mother, who ordered him to stay home no matter what, assuring him that there were things in their world that could be too dangerous for even the strongest, and that it was better to be close to those he loved so much. Ak Wu Ran sat with his eyes closed, the heaviness in his soul becoming more and more noticeable with each passing moment, and sweat slowly rolled down his face, as if trying to wash away all the memories of that terrible night that would forever remain in his heart. Then, despite his mother's warnings, he did not listen to her, looked out from behind the door, and saw how the head of the demonic cult, with his powerful and deadly gesture, destroyed his parents, taking their lives right before his eyes and leaving him in a world of complete horror. Still small, Ak Wu Ran froze in shock, unable to tear his eyes away from this horrific sight. His big black eyes, full of pain and invisible fear, reflected all the chaos that was happening in his soul at that moment, and his small tail and hair trembled with fear. The man had long, straight hair that was a deep scarlet color, like the blood that slowly flowed down his face, giving him a terrifying mystery, as if he himself was the embodiment of what lurked in the darkest corners of this world. Suddenly, the stern Go Jungma turned around sharply upon hearing the footsteps approaching him. His scarlet eyes flashed, and the blood covering his face only emphasized his fierce appearance. He was ready to face whoever dared to approach at this moment. The young man, feeling his consciousness waking up from sleep, opened his eyes wide, as if waking up at the very moment when reality and nightmare intertwine, and his heart, struck by this realization, was ready to burst out of his chest, feeling the need to act. He rose from his seat when he heard familiar footsteps that filled his heart with anxiety, and a premonition that his life would change again in the blink of an eye when this young lady appeared before him again with some important question or request. Clenching his fists in irritation, he felt anger sweeping through his body like an ominous storm, but he held it in, trying not to show weakness in front of Chung Li-hua, who, despite his dislike, stood at the entrance and did not take her eyes off him. Indeed, there stood Chung Li-hua in front of him, all wet and soaking wet, her hair stuck to her face, and her eyes, full of worry and anxiety, closely following his every movement, as if looking for an answer to everything that tormented her in his face. The man's voice was cold and determined as he said that he had already ordered her not to come here many times, not realizing how those words were painfully echoing in her heart, because she had only come to help, despite all the prohibitions. Chung Li-hua looked at him with sadness, her big eyes reflecting not only an understanding of the pain, but also the realization of how hard it was for the boy in the demon clan. And now he stood before her as a man broken by the past and his loneliness. Seeing her confusion, Akwu Ran felt a strange regret creep into his heart, and despite his irritability, he gently asked what was wrong with her, because he couldn't help but notice her despair and pain that she was trying to hide. The little girl, with a worried expression on her face and tenderness in her voice, quietly asked if the young man was in pain, for her heart could not remain indifferent to his suffering, and she anxiously tried to understand how to help him at that moment. Chung Li-hua, reaching out her hands to Akwu Ran with the intention of helping and checking his condition, carefully asked if he had a fever or was sick, because her concern for him was becoming more and more insistent and unbearable with each passing moment. Although Akwu Ran was about to sternly order the girl not to touch him, his inner resistance suddenly weakened and he froze, feeling how her unbearable concern for him overshadowed all his thoughts, and he did not know how to react to this. Unable to hide his feelings any longer, he grabbed her hand in alarm and cried out in agitation, asking why her hands were so cold, feeling his own concern for her condition only growing stronger. Chung Li-hua awkwardly replied that it was raining outside, and the weather was far from favorable, which made her stay in this place even more uncomfortable and unpleasant. She felt the cold and dampness that penetrated into her very soul. Akwu Ran fell silent without saying a word, only watching her intently, with worry in his eyes, and his face reflecting concern for her health and condition, which he could not hide despite his best efforts to remain calm and composed. The young man again asked the lady, with a slight hint of urgency in his voice, to leave this place, but she resolutely resisted and was not going to leave, not agreeing to his request, which seemed to her too insistent and not understanding her situation. Taking off her bag, she handed the bag to the guy, telling him that she was ready to leave everything behind, to leave this cult with him and start a new life full of hope and change, despite all the difficulties and dangers that await them ahead. Akwu Ran froze awkwardly, not expecting her to say such words, which sounded unexpected and made him feel completely at a loss, because he did not know how to properly respond to her frankness and directness at such a difficult and tense moment. The girl, pressing her hands to her chest, stated that she saw how bad he was in this house, and that he clearly did not want to become the heir of their clan, saying this with sincere concern, which so surprised Akwu Ran, because she could hardly understand his entire difficult situation. After which she pulled the young man by the hand and said that she would help him leave here, start a new life, and live peacefully, far from everything that brought him pain and suffering, promising to be his support in the search for a better future. Akwu Ran flinched and asked what she was talking about, not fully understanding what exactly she meant and how she could offer help despite all the possible obstacles and dangers that could appear on their way, because it seemed too bold a move on her part. When he stopped, the girl also could not go further and held his hand. Not wanting to let go, as if this was her last chance to help, and she was not going to lose this chance, despite all the doubts and fears that gripped her. But a few moments later, when they had run a few meters along a forest path, hiding from the rain under thick trees, they were already racing together, not paying attention to any obstacles, only trying to move forward as quickly as possible, overcoming this thicket. Chung Li Hua walked confidently, despite the rain that poured down tirelessly. Her face lit up with a smile, as if she did not feel either the weight or the cold wetness, and each step was full of determination, as if she knew what awaited them beyond this rainy forest. Ak Wu Ran, silently following her, did not know how to properly respond to her calmness and confidence, because he still doubted that he could cope with what lay ahead of them. But he continued to walk, since there was no other way and no other choice. The little girl, pointing to an old wooden staircase located deep in the forest, added that when he reached its foot, he would definitely find a village there where he could take shelter and perhaps rest a little before continuing on his way. Pushing the young man in the back, she handed him a bag containing expensive things, selling which he would be able to live peacefully for several years, without thinking about anything, without unnecessary worries and anxieties, finally getting a chance for long-awaited peace and rest. Chung Li Hua felt her heart beating hard, but she still stubbornly remained silent despite the turmoil that shook her inner world, not allowing her feelings and fears to be revealed, keeping them to herself as if trying to control her weakness. She suddenly felt dizzy, and the world around her began to blur like fog, and the young Ak Wu Ran became increasingly blurry in her eyes, as did the situation she found herself in, from which there was no easy way out, and her strength was leaving her more and more. Therefore, the girl firmly ordered the young man to leave, and she herself tried to stand on her poor legs, feeling how weakness was taking over her whole body, and how hard it was to remain in this state, not wanting to show her helplessness and vulnerability. Clutching the bag to himself, the young man with his hair down looked at his companion in shock, with sadness in his eyes, as if understanding what she was doing for him, but not knowing what to say to at least slightly ease her suffering and restore her feminine confidence. The rain dripped down his face and wet clothes, penetrating every fold of his clothing, but finally he closed his eyes and turned away, deciding to obey the beautiful lady's command, no matter how hard it was for him, knowing that there was no other way and there would be no other choice. He began to walk quickly up the steps of the stairs, feeling the raindrops running down his skin and clothes, but despite all the external circumstances, he continued to walk, without looking back, without stopping, as if everything else had ceased to matter. Chung Li Hua, having calmed down, stopped, and, feeling her strength drained away, suddenly fell down, tiredly sinking onto the cold floor in the rain, feeling her body could no longer resist, and at that moment, she finally allowed herself to relax. Sweet Chung Li Hua firmly stated that she knew the boy's true desires, his desire to leave the cult and start a quiet life far away, in solitude, in the middle of nature, like a cattle breeder, far from all these betrayals and crazy intrigues. Then in the cave, Ak Wu Ran froze in shock, not understanding how the girl could know about his most secret dreams, because he never spoke about them out loud, and everything she said seemed to have burst from his very heart, in his night dreams, where he remained frank. Ak Wu Ran bowed his head and closed his eyes, wishing that this pain would go away. If only she weren't the daughter of his enemy. If only there wasn't that bond that separated them, that haunted him, and made him feel like everything he did would lead to destruction. When the boy was very little, he often rubbed his nose with his fingers and dreamed of something else, of how he could live in a world where there were no enemies, where there was no need to fight, where he could be free, protected, and not fear for anyone. Go Young Ma knew the child's father and communicated with him often, as their lives were intertwined in some hidden ways, and their relationship was always wary, full of hidden meanings and unresolved secrets that no one dared to speak out loud. The protagonist's father then introduced his son to his old friend, a strange man with red hair, who, despite his unusual appearance and silent character, hid behind himself a whole story full of secrets and mysteries that could change everything. The two men, sitting on the veranda, peacefully drank sake, chatting, and looked like old good friends, enjoying the moment and the warm evening, where every sip of the drink seemed to bring them closer to even greater mutual understanding and friendship. Back then, the head of the demonic cult didn't look dangerous. He sat motionless, calm, with red hair that contrasted with his pale skin, as if that appearance hid much more than it might seem at first glance. And then, suddenly turning around, he looked at the boy. His gaze was cold and determined, but Ak Woo Ron did not yet know that this moment would become the turning point that would lead him to become the killer of his own parents. One evening, the boy, tired from his experiences and the events he had lived through, lay down on his bed and pressed himself against the pillow, seeking comfort in its softness and warmth, as if dreaming that everything that was happening around him was just a nightmare from which he would soon wake up. He was awakened by loud, piercing cries. His name sounded with alarm and concern, and the gentle hands of his parents tried to calm him down. But in their touch he felt tension, as if something terrible and inevitable was already happening, threatening their peace. His mother, hugging her son tightly and holding him close, lovingly ordered him to stay at home, sit in his room, and not go anywhere. And in her voice there was not only concern, but also a hidden fear that could not go unnoticed. Ak Woo Ron, obediently following her instructions, remained in his room, but curiosity got the better of him, and he began to eavesdrop on the conversation behind the door, where a strange stranger, with a menacing expression, demanded that his parents confess where they hid him. The child sat in silence, hiding in the closed space, in the place where he was hidden, and quietly, barely breathing, listened to the adults arguing, feeling how his little heart was beating faster from fear and uncertainty of what would happen next, and what would happen to him if he was discovered. He sat in the dark closet that stood in his room, hidden and absolutely motionless, as if his presence might be discovered at any moment, and he could not allow himself to be found until all was quiet behind the door. When the screams finally died down, Ak Woo Ron quietly, with great anxiety in his heart, went outside, with the sincere hope of calling his mother. But instead of finding her, he witnessed a terrible scene that would forever remain in his memory. Outside, under the dim moonlight, he saw Go Jung Ma standing completely still. His clothes dyed a bright blood red, and on the ground, lying motionless, were his parents, their bodies lifeless, with nothing to indicate that they could be alive. The boy stood frozen in shock, his heart pounding wildly, but he couldn't move. His body seemed to have turned to stone, and his mind seemed to refuse to understand what was happening. He just stood there in a daze, not knowing what to do. Turning around, Ak Woo Ron suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to flee growing inside him, to escape as quickly as possible and save his life. But despite this, fear did not leave him, and he did not know what to do in this moment of great horror. But Go Jung Ma, instantly noticing his movement and realizing that it could become a problem, immediately focused all his attention on the boy, and, without wasting a second, moved after him, determined not to let him get away, and not to let him hide in this moment. He extended his hand, resolutely directing it towards the boy who was trying to break free, with the intention of grabbing him firmly and, ignoring his resistance, taking him with him, taking him to the palace itself, where the inevitable meeting awaited him. Ever since he was kidnapped and made the heir to a demonic cult, endowed with monstrous strength and dark ambitions, Ak Woo Ron, tormented by internal conflicts, has spent every day endlessly honing his blade skills in a secluded courtyard. His soul was filled with an insatiable thirst for revenge, and waving his stick in the air, he imagined himself in battle with his enemies, mentally repaying them for all the evil done to him, while feeling how justice was slowly but surely being restored in his world. But despite everything that happened to him, he never gave up his dream, to return to what it once was, to the simple, peaceful existence of a cattle breeder on a farm, where there would be no place for these dark ambitions and evil cults. He was completely shocked when Chung Li Hua appeared before him, calmly declaring that she knew about his dreams of living a simple life as a farmer, and that she was willing to help him escape, giving him a chance to choose his own path, to finally be free of everything that was holding him back. He trusted her from the very day she handed him a cookie, thus showing simple but sincere concern, and he could not forget this gesture, because there was something more to it than just a random act of kindness, but a real friendly affection. The baby took care of him, fed him, and protected him. And although life did not allow them to be friends in the usual sense, in another, more peaceful world, they could become not just allies, but real close people, sharing common joys and sorrows. Ak Woo Ron, feeling the freedom he had been striving for many years, ran forward, with each step getting closer to his dream. And at that moment, his face lit up with a smile full of hope, because he could finally believe that the fire of freedom lit within him could actually be a reality. But, standing on the threshold of his freedom, he suddenly stopped, turning around to take a last look at the little lady, to say goodbye to her and thank her for her help, which became a light for him in this dark world, giving him the strength to go on. And then the young man noticed that Chung Li Hua was lying motionless on the floor, and feeling agitated, he became afraid. His dream of freedom instantly disappeared, replaced by the cold realization that her will now depended on something much more important. Without a moment's hesitation, Ak Woo Ron instantly rushed towards the girl, anxiously grabbed her in his strong arms, as if trying to convey his strength and hope to her, and with unwavering determination carried her into the house, into the warm shelter where, overcome with fear, he hoped to find a healer. So Ren, who was desperately and unsuccessfully trying to find help, suddenly, as if sensing something was wrong, noticed a familiar figure, the heir of the cult, who, with a look devoid of any hope, was carrying the lifeless body of a baby girl, helplessly and limply resting in his arms. In shock and filled with anxiety, the girl asked in fear what had happened, to which Ak Woo Ron quickly and briefly replied that they needed to bring warm blankets, something to drink, and call a doctor to save the girl from imminent disaster. Obediently and without hesitation, so Ren rushed to carry out the orders. Her steps were quick and confident, while the young man, shocked by what was happening, sat on his knees next to the bed where his little friend lay and did not know what to do next, feeling helpless. His hand froze in midair, not daring to touch the bag the little girl had given him earlier. And for a moment he thought, trying to understand what she had so carefully hidden in this small but significant object, as if she was passing on something important to him. With interest and a little excitement, Ak Woo Ron carefully looked inside the bag, wanting to understand what exactly the little girl was going to give him. What could be so important that he would pay attention to it at the most critical moment of her condition? There, among the neatly stacked items, he discovered amazing crystal flowers, as if carved from ice, which stood with incredible delicacy and fragility, looking so expensive and valuable that he was overcome with a sense of wonder and awe. After thinking about what was happening, Ak Woo Ron came to the sad conclusion that the reason for the girl's weakness was that she had put all her energy into creating many beautiful and complex flowers, not realizing how much it was draining her body, mind, and soul. Clutching the precious ice flowers in his hand, he wondered if she had really tried so hard for him, wanting to fulfill his dream of freedom and escape, dreaming of a better future, despite all the hardships and her own suffering that she was going through. Chung Li Hua lay on the bed, lifeless and motionless, her body completely unconscious after she had exhausted all her strength in a ruthless attempt to help, leaving Ak Woo Ron with a heavy burden on his heart and an unbearable sense of guilt and bitterness. Pursing his lips in determination, Ak Woo Ron made the difficult decision to do everything he could to keep them away from each other, as he realized that their closeness was only poisoning both of their lives, leading to pain and disappointment that was impossible to ignore. And yet, despite his worries and inner doubts, the handsome Ak Woo Ron hid one of the crystal ice flowers in the pocket of his hanfu, hoping to keep at least one as a reminder of what she had so painstakingly created and given to him. At this moment, Chung Li Hua, lying on the bed, began to move restlessly. Her body was in convulsions, and her face was distorted with fear, as if she was dreaming something terrible, and her health left much to be desired, giving no hope for a quick recovery. Finally, she opened her eyes with difficulty, raising herself slightly on her elbows. Her large blue eyes, full of confusion, looked around the room, trying to figure out where she was and what was going on, her thoughts confused by the anxiety and confusion she felt. Seeing the young man sitting next to her bed, She asked in surprise why he was still there, and whether he had already fled from their clan, as seemed logical to her, since the circumstances would require him to leave immediately so as not to find himself in real danger. The young baby, holding back her tears, could not contain her feelings and began to cry, realizing that his decision not to escape was due to her, and that she had ruined everything, ruining his chance for freedom, becoming the reason that his escape never took place. He clutched the flowers in his hand tighter, as if trying to hold on to the last of his strength, and Ak Woo Ron, screaming, said that he didn't care about her. But he was lying, wanting to get rid of the girl he couldn't stand anymore, despite his feelings. The poor little girl was crying quietly, and her heart was full of pain. She could not understand why everything was so difficult, and her large tears slowly flowed down her plump cheeks, as if reflecting all the terrible bitterness that burned her fragile soul. The young man could not understand why there was such an expression on the beauty's face. She looked so confused and upset that his heart was filled with deep anxiety, and he could not understand what exactly could cause such a heavy melancholy in her eyes. His hand trembled, and he wanted so much to comfort the little girl, but he understood that he could not do this, because she was the daughter of his enemy, and even at that moment, when his heart told him otherwise, he could not violate his principles despite the fact that he felt an internal conflict. Walking a little closer to the beauty, Ak Woo Ron, feeling irritated, rudely told her not to behave like that anymore. Otherwise, if she continued like that, he would not be able to restrain himself and might hurt her, despite his desire to avoid violence. Chung Li Hua was left alone, sitting on the bed, lost in her thoughts, while her companion walked away without a word, leaving her alone. The silence that filled the room seemed heavy and unbearable, and thoughts of what had happened swirled restlessly in her head. 3 years passed, and So Ren, opening the window, turned to the lady and said in a restrained voice that it was time to go to bed, although the day was not yet over. And in her words, there was a slight weariness from everything that had happened over these years, filled with difficult moments. Clutching the cloth to her chest, the maid firmly stated that her mistress should not go out anywhere until the woman herself went to town on business, assuring her that everything would be fine and she would take care of all the necessary matters without leaving her alone. Chung Li Hua grew up, became prettier, and, hugging a pillow to herself, with a mocking and playful expression on her face, asked if So Ren was going to see her lover, noticing how her words were full of light teasing and a little keen curiosity, which she did not hide. While putting the girl to bed, the lady tried to hide the bitterness in her voice, assuring her that she was just going about her business and not to kiss anyone. But despite her assurances, there was a note of regret in her words, barely hidden under her outward calm. The woman said goodnight to the girl, and she, with a slight smile on her face, responded in kind, their words sounding warm and sincere, as usually happens before going to bed. But in this moment, there was something more than just an ordinary nighttime farewell. The maid turned off the light, and the room was plunged into a thick darkness where everything around became invisible, and Chung Li Hua dozed, feeling how sleep gradually overtook her. But in her mind, there were still disturbing thoughts and memories of events that did not let her go. However, when So Ren left, Chung Li Hua opened her eyes, and her thoughts returned to her friend, whom she respected and trusted so much. She thought about how he continued to cultivate in seclusion, hiding from everyone and remaining in his own world. On that rainy day, he returned the bag of treasures to the girl and then went back to his cave, where he decided to remain alone, immersed in meditation, completely detached from the outside world, and it seemed that everything around him did not matter. Clenching her fist in anger, the girl noticed that some of the ice flowers in the bag were missing, and although she tried not to show her resentment, she clearly understood that Ak Woo Ron had kept a few for himself, and this awakened a hidden resentment and a desire to restore justice in her. The upset beauty turned away, and without saying a word, lay down on her other side, trying to hide her feelings. But everything was seething inside her, and she could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety that continued to pull her into the unknown. Suddenly, she saw a small piece of ice next to her and asked in surprise what it meant. Was he really going to take away her chi energy again like before? And what did he want from her this time? making her feel so uncomfortable. Looking at the branch with an irritated look, the girl firmly stated that she could not feed it day and night because it was too difficult and exhausting, and her patience was coming to an end, no matter how hard she tried to understand what was happening around her. By turning away to go to bed, she had angered the magical object, which had not expected such actions from its owner, and its reaction was swift and furious, as if it felt insulted by her indifference, which was immediately obvious. The wand began to tap and hit her on the blanket, preventing her from falling asleep. With each blow, her patience was exhausted, and sounds were heard in the dark room, as if the magic itself was trying to return attention to itself, despite the resistance of its owner, making her irritated. Chung Li Hua grabbed the stick and shouted in desperation that if she did not stop, she would not hesitate to throw her into the stove as firewood, hoping that this threat would finally stop her annoying behavior and return the long-awaited order to her rest. Suddenly, Chung Li Hua froze, feeling her heart clench, and magic, dark and demonic, suddenly penetrated her consciousness, and she could hardly understand where exactly this power came from, leaving her completely confused and anxious. Standing up, she quickly walked to the exit and, leaving the room, felt the sharp smell of blood, which immediately attracted her attention, as if filling the air with anxiety, forcing her to move in that direction, not having time to tear herself away from this feeling that something important was happening nearby. The beauty took a bag of red beads with her, ready to use them for protection if the situation got out of control, because she knew that they could help at any moment if the danger became real and the threat began to manifest itself. Looking around in confusion, the lady began to think about what could have happened that made her act so abruptly. Her small steps were confident, but she felt how anxiety and worry were growing with each passing moment. She was wearing a pink dress that rustled slightly as she moved. Quietly, like a real shadow, the little girl began to eavesdrop on someone's conversation. Standing around the corner, her small steps made no sound, and she was like a cat, ready to slip away at any moment if she was discovered. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear. A maid was kneeling, her figure looking fragile and vulnerable in the dim light. But in front of her stood a tall, powerful figure in dark clothing and a mask, like something dark and terrible, ready to destroy everything in its path. The man threatened the maid with his sword, its tip glittering in the semi-darkness, and his voice sounded cold and menacing, like a knife cutting through the silence as he demanded that she tell him where the child he had come for was, leaving her no choice. The black-haired spy, his gaze not hiding the tip of his sword, said that he was ready to give the maid a quick and easy death if she immediately told him where the child was, and his words were filled with such determination that her heart was filled with anxiety. Chung Li Hua quickly walked towards the exit. Her steps were determined and confident as she decided that she had to call for help, and in her hands she clutched the magic staff as a symbol of her determination and strength to face any threats. But the wand suddenly began to resist, as if magic itself sensed danger, unwilling to move on and resisting, as if it felt the same fear and anxiety as its owner, not wanting to leave at that moment. Suddenly, as if the nightmare itself had come to life, the killer appeared behind the girl. His figure was sinister and frightening, and the mask hiding his face was covered in blood, which gave him an even more terrifying and threatening appearance, and he slowly approached her. The man, approaching the girl, grinned, took off his mask, and when it fell to the ground, it turned out that along the corners of his mouth there were deep scars, like traces of long-forgotten battles, and he said that she saved him precious time by coming straight into his arms. The little girl, feeling her heart begin to beat faster and faster, tried her best not to show her fear. However, her body did not obey, and with every step back she felt how panic was growing, although she tried to hold on, not allowing herself to retreat. The man walked slowly and confidently after her, his footsteps muffled, his voice low and frightening, penetrating the darkest corners of her mind as he mockingly declared that he was a real monster, asking if she was afraid of being at his mercy. Answering his question regarding what happened to his face, the young man said with a cold grin that it was the result of his mentor's actions, who could not stand the crying of his ward in childhood and decided to punish him in this way, leaving terrible marks. With a heavy sigh, The man continued to complain about his cruel teacher, who tore off the nails of his students for the slightest mistake, as if his suffering was as deep as his cruel actions, which left marks on his soul. The girl, trying to hide her real fear and play the role of a naive fool, with a sly expression on her face, suggested that the guy play hide and seek, hoping that this would distract his attention and give her the necessary minutes to figure out how to escape from his icy grip. The man began to say in a joyful and crazy tone that he had always dreamed of playing with someone, but this time he had come here with a different purpose, with the intention of cutting off the lady's head, mocking her naive attempts to escape. The guy's mood changed instantly. He stood up abruptly, lost in thought, and said that the one who hired him was too vague and did not say anything specific, leaving only a vague goal and unclear instructions, which only increased his anger and irritation. The terrified Chung Li-hua suddenly realized that before her stood a dangerous assassin from the Ice Palace, who had patiently waited for 3 long years for the right moment to carry out his cruel revenge. And in his eyes, there was an icy determination to complete his plan. Smiling tensely, the girl with a sly and slightly mocking expression on her face declared that she could not play hide and seek with him without a head, and seeing his doubt, the killer, surprised by her audacity, finally agreed, feeling that her words were hiding something more. The man added with a cold expression on his face that if she really wanted their game to be fair, then she should give him permission to cut off the other limb, and then, in his opinion, everything would be in full accordance with her terms and rules. The sweet noblewoman, looking at the man with horror, asked in fear what part of his body he was going to cut off, and the mercenary, who seemed absolutely ruthless and emotionless, suggested that she choose herself, as if her life now depended entirely on her decision. Frowning and holding back all her emotions, Chung Li-hua resolutely rolled up her sleeve and extended her hand, ready to do anything to somehow confuse this cruel killer and leave a mark on herself, hoping that this would help her maintain at least a small amount of control. The guy, feeling the weight of the blade in his hand, clenched in the grip of his determination, sternly ordering the girl not to move, because any slightest movement on her part could lead to unpredictable consequences, and he was not going to waste time on unnecessary risks. The little girl, already prepared for the pain, waited with her eyes closed for the blow, but when nothing happened, she opened her eyes in surprise, not understanding why everything was taking so long, and feeling a strange sense of bewilderment that everything could suddenly change. A magical branch, as if the magic of nature itself had come to life at that moment, quickly appeared right in front of the man's face, not giving him the slightest chance to complete his blow, stopping him at the last moment, and as if sending a warning that the girl's death was not destined to overtake. Behind the man, as if out of nowhere, another human figure appeared. Its movements were quick and confident, as if this person had been waiting for the right moment to intervene, and now the time had come to act to save the girl. It was a maid, her face full of determination. She grabbed the mercenary by the belt with lightning speed, decisively ordering her mistress to run away immediately, realizing that they had to flee because if they stayed, they would both die. Without wasting a second, Chung Li-hua, feeling her heart pounding wildly, broke into a run with desperate determination, with one hand tightly clutching the bag, which was not just an object for her, but her last chance for salvation and a chance to escape from the killer's clutches. The killer, not wanting to lose his prey, followed her at a quick pace, his determined steps echoing in her ears, and the sound of his shoes screeching across the floor was a terrible reminder that he would not stop until he caught the young girl. Quickly, the little girl, holding her breath, slipped into one of the empty rooms, her body trembling with fear and her heart pounding wildly because she understood perfectly well that every move she made could give away her location to this deadly pursuer. Hiding behind the screen, the girl knelt down. Her whole body was exhausted and almost immobile, and her eyes were full of tears that could not be held back. She could not hide her emotions, and, covering her face with her hands, began to cry quietly, unable to find the strength in herself for anything else. There, behind the thin walls, a threatening man was approaching with every step, his footsteps sounding like a harbinger of imminent disaster. And in his hands, he held the tip of a blade, with which he was ready to deliver a fatal blow at any second, if only he could find her and catch her. The little girl clutched her mouth, desperately trying not to make a single sound. Her breathing became intermittent, and tears, unable to hold back, dripped down her cheeks like little raindrops, trying to hide her presence. But every sound seemed too loud. Desperately, Chung Li-hua closed her eyes and clenched her fists, mentally calling out to her father, the head of the cult, hoping for his help and salvation. But despite all her desperate requests, there was no answer, not even the slightest sign that he heard her. Only deafening silence. Suddenly, a familiar voice was heard next to her, quietly but confidently calling her name, and she turned around in surprise, not believing her ears, because she could not understand where it could come from at such a moment when it seemed that her death was inevitable. The young girl turned around and was shocked to see the cute Ak Woo Ron standing next to her, her old friend whom she had not expected to see, and a storm of emotions instantly arose in her chest, because there was no time to understand how he ended up here, and that he had come right now. Chung Li-hua was overjoyed to see her old friend. Her heart beat faster, and tears appeared in her eyes that she could not hold back, because at that moment, when she was so scared, the appearance of Ak Woo Ron became a real salvation for her. The young man had grown up and become even more attractive. His face radiated confidence, and he was wearing an elegant light hanfu. His hair was neatly tied into a ponytail, and he looked like a real hero who had just stepped out of the pages of an ancient epic book. Like a character from an epic story, the boy, without hesitation, stated that he felt how much the lady needed his help, and therefore decided to go and personally check on her condition and make sure that everything was all right. Wiping the tears from his companion's face, the guy, with sincere concern in his voice, said that he was glad to see her safe and happy that she was finally okay, and that her suffering was not in vain, because he was always ready to support her in this difficult moment. Through tears, barely containing her emotions, the beautiful girl forced out the words that she was being pursued by a hired killer, and that despite all her efforts to hide and avoid him, she could not escape this merciless pursuit. The young man, taking her hand firmly, said firmly and calmly that she should not blame herself for the death of the servants, because everything that happened was the result of cruel circumstances, and she should not feel guilty for those events that were beyond her control. After these words, he extended his hand and helped his companion to her feet, and then, with determination in his eyes, he showed her a hidden passage that would lead to the city, where she could hide from her pursuers for a while and avoid possible danger. Hidden in the depths of an old closet, the secret passage gaped with impenetrable darkness, from which a cold blew, and inside, in its very core, barely discernible in the semi-darkness, a man's hand was visible, tightly clutching the open door. The girl, clutching her magic staff and bag tightly to herself, could not bring herself to leave the young man alone with the mercenary, feeling that it would be difficult for him to cope with the threat alone, and her heart sank with anxiety. Ak Woo Ron, noticing her fear and hesitation, confidently replied that the killer did not come alone, but with a whole group, and despite this, he was ready to protect her at any cost, even if it meant facing numerous enemies. He stood between the girl and the threat, protecting her with his body, until demonic qi began to spread around. Its ominous cold could be felt, and the smell of blood filled the air, causing the girl's heart to beat faster in fear. Grasping the blade tightly, Ak Woo Ron, with determination in his eyes, quietly said that she must run, and promised that he would fight the enemies himself, giving her a chance to escape and find shelter, because her safety was more important to him than his own life. Chung Li-hua pressed her lips together, her eyes filled with anxiety and fear, because despite all the promises and determination, she understood perfectly well that she would not be able to help in the fight, and that she needed to be by his side to somehow support him in this difficult moment. But in her thoughts, the thought increasingly sounded that he, despite his youth, would soon become much stronger than he was now, and would turn into a great warrior who would be able to stand against the most terrible threats, protecting himself and his loved ones. Not wanting to part with him, the girl grabbed his shoulders tightly, squeezing them with her hands, and felt her heart beating heavily in her chest, because despite his courage and resilience, he was only a teenager, and she could not leave him alone at such a moment. Chung Li Hua, with bitterness and deep regret in her voice, reminded him that he had said earlier that he hated her, and now she could not understand why he would suddenly risk his life for her, when everything between them seemed so complicated, confusing, and contradictory. The young man, meeting her gaze, froze for a moment, and his eyes reflected a multitude of emotions. In his thoughts, he realized that he did not hate her at all, and these words, spoken once, were only the result of rage and pain that he hid from her, afraid to admit even to himself his feelings. He carefully took the little bag she held out to him from her hands, and for a moment their fingers touched, leaving an unforgettable mark on his heart that he could not shake off, as if this gesture were a sign of feelings and deep affection that had been hidden all this time. Ak Wuran, sighing quietly, and with a bit of confusion, admitted that he didn't know exactly why he did this, but something in him always pulled him to take care of her. And these words, full of tenderness and care, he said as a true confession, which he kept silent about for so long, hiding his feelings. Then, with a gentle push, he directed her towards the passage, ordering her to run, and his voice sounded firm and decisive, as if he was ready to sacrifice himself if only she would be safe, because her life was more important to him than anything else, and he could no longer watch her suffer. The boy, with determination in his voice, told her to find the biggest house in the city and hide there, where she would be safe, as he understood that this was the only way she could escape the impending threat and save her life. Before the girl could take a single step, the doors to the room suddenly burst open with a bang, and the very same killer she had tried to avoid for so long appeared on the threshold, his eyes full of malice and determination to complete his mission without leaving any living traces. At this time, in another place, So Ren was sitting in the clan leader's office, her face calm and confident, and she was proudly praising the young mistress, admiring her outstanding talents and how she skillfully dealt with any difficulties, astonishing everyone with her courage and determination. The maid was amazed at how smart and clever this girl turned out to be, because her outstanding intellect and intelligence significantly exceeded all expectations, and she could not help but admire such rare and valuable qualities for her age. The man took the cup with the drink, slowly sipped a little, and then, with mild interest, asked what progress the girl had made in studying martial arts, inquiring how much she had managed to master the technique and what she still had to learn in the future. The woman said with a smile and full of confidence that the little girl had no problem accumulating qi, which meant that she would be able to successfully cope with her studies and combat missions in the future without experiencing difficulties on this path to her improvement. The man put the cup on the table, lost in thought about his daughter, sincerely hoping that she would be happy, find a loving husband, have children, and live a long, peaceful life filled with joy, harmony, and true happiness. Looking at his reflection in the teacup, Go Jung-ma could not help but recognize his daughter's truly outstanding talent. He knew that it would be much more useful for her to learn military skills and learn to live in such a way that no one would dare to look down on her. Standing up from his seat, the man was about to return to the house, but was stopped by So-ren's voice, which sounded unexpectedly, causing him to turn around again and pay attention to what was happening around him before he took the next step. Go Jung-ma treasured the memories of his daughter in his mind, especially the times when she would hug his hand so sweetly and tenderly, and these memories always made his heart move with the warmth and care she gave him. Go Jung-ma looked towards the memories with a slight smile, and they, like a warm blanket, warmed his soul, reminding him of the true happiness he once experienced and the love that did not fade despite the passing years, illuminating the dark corners of his heart. When suddenly the servant opened the doors, holding a bloody blade in his hands, loudly called out to his master. His clothes were covered in blood, and his face was distorted with horror, which made him act with unusual haste, obviously being in deep shock and panic, not knowing how to convey the terrible news. Falling to his knees before Go Jung-ma, the servant announced with a trembling voice that their palace was under attack by people from the north, and this threat made Go Jung-ma wary, preparing for the possible danger that threatened everything he loved. Go Jung-ma frowned, his face became tense, and calmly asked if the elders weren't there to guard. while So Ren, who was standing behind, covered her mouth in horror, realizing that the situation was much more serious than they could imagine. The servant, with a trembling voice, began to tell that the elders had left, having decided to take revenge on the Northerners for their cruel actions, and while they were leaving the house, the scoundrels, taking advantage of their absence, attacked their monastery, destroying everything that was dear to them. So Ren felt a sudden dizziness, because at one moment she realized that the lady was left alone in the house, without protection and help, and the thought that she might be in danger awakened in her a worry that did not give her peace. Furiously, with icy calm, the man declared that what had happened was a carefully planned act of sabotage, and although he hid his anger, his face could not hide the determination and cold fury that burned in his eyes. So Ren, falling to her knees before the master, with a sincere request and a trembling voice, begged him to allow her to immediately return to the palace, to their home, to protect the young lady, because she could not remain in such a situation, knowing how great the threat was. But when she received only silence in response, the girl, without hesitation, raised her head, feeling a question hanging in the air that no one was in a hurry to answer, and her gaze tried to find at least some kind of answer in the silence, which became more and more alarming and oppressive. But in the room where everyone had recently been, there was now no one except for two maids who were sitting on the floor, looking confused and completely lost, their eyes unable to understand what was happening and who would now make decisions in this situation. The hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor, filling the space with an alarming sound, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the sound, and the ominous silence around was becoming thicker, as if something inevitable was about to happen at any moment. Ak Woo Ron stood motionless, not moving, his gaze directed forward, and in front of him, like a shadow, the figure of the killer appeared, who, without blinking, asked where the girl had gone. His voice was quiet, but full of confidence, menace, and ruthless determination. The man, with a fierce determination on his face and a mad smile, threatened to kill the boy if he did not reveal the whole truth. His gaze was cold and uncompromising, and his words penetrated the soul, causing only horror and a feeling of inevitability of his threats. Ak Woo Ron, holding himself as confidently as ever, blade at the tip, gave a decisive order to the mercenary to leave this place immediately, his voice full of authority, and his every gesture emphasizing his determination to not allow any further threats or violence. Chung Li Hua, sitting in a secluded secret room, covered her mouth with her hands in horror. Her eyes were full of fear and anxiety. She could not calm down, afraid that her friend might be harmed, and her every breath was filled with worries about his fate. Shrugging his shoulders, the mercenary explained to the boy that he could not leave this place without the princess, because she was his order, and his entire mission depended on her safety, so he was forced to act according to the plan, having no other choice in this situation. Ak Woo Ron sighed heavily, his patience exhausted, and feeling the internal fire raging in his chest, he angrily ordered the other person to disappear, as his constant irritation was beginning to threaten his further peace, and he was not going to tolerate it any longer. The man didn't like this, his face distorted with anger, and he, without hiding his displeasure, called the boy a rude person, and a sarcastic note sounded in his voice, with which he unashamedly showed his contempt and dissatisfaction with Ak Woo Ron's behavior. Slowly, with a cold, confident smile on his face, he began to approach the boy, sarcastically commenting on his trembling, as if this fear was clear evidence of his weakness, and there was a bitter mockery in his words, as if he were the height of strength. As their swords clashed, a spark flew, and, as if on cue, a brutal fight began, full of fury and desperation, each blow precise and decisive, and the air filled with energy, as if a harbinger of the inevitable end to their confrontation. Soon the other murderers arrived, and looking at them, the chief, with cold determination, ordered them to play with the boy, to amuse themselves a little, while he himself went about searching for the girl, for time was of the utmost value, and he could not afford to lose a second. Ak Woo Ron was wounded and was holding on with his last strength, feeling his body weakening with each passing moment, but he continued to fight, because there were numerous enemies in front of him, and he was alone against an entire army, which made his situation much more difficult. The frightened Chung Li-hua sat in the secret room, covering her mouth with her hand so as not to give herself away. Her eyes were full of fear, and her every glance was filled with anxiety, as if everything around her was becoming a threat. And in her every movement, there was a sense of hopelessness. As she cried, she realized that she could do nothing to help her friend, clutching the bag helplessly in her hand, feeling her own helplessness consuming her as fear and despair grew. And despite her efforts, she could offer no real help. In her mind, she prayed for the boy to survive, because Ak Woo Ron was the main character of this story, and there was no place in this world for him to die an inglorious death. He should not give up, because his destiny was far from complete, and he still had a lot to overcome. And she herself, despite everything that was happening around her, was preparing to run away as quickly as possible, deciding that the first thing she should do was call for help to get him back, because only she could try to change the course of events if she managed to do it in time. Suddenly, she froze in place, unable to move, as the footsteps that had been clearly heard until then suddenly stopped. A terrible thought, like an icy wind, penetrated her mind. What if the main character, Ak Woo Ron himself, still died despite all their efforts? This story had long since moved beyond the usual plot, and she felt everything turning upside down. The girl's evil mother was dead, and now the Northern Palace had declared war on them, ruining all their plans and threatening everything that was important. The little girl, in deep shock, clutched her things in her hands, pressing them to her chest, trying to hold on to at least some support in this world, not knowing what to do now, because every step seemed wrong, and ahead there was only uncertainty and fear. Her eyes instantly opened, and as if suddenly remembering something important, she realized that she had a secret weapon in her hands that could be the last chance in this hopeless situation, giving her confidence that she could still help. In her hands was a bag of red beads that emitted a mysterious glow, as if they themselves were a source of power, ready to explode at any moment and become the weapon that could change the course of this entire dangerous game. The beauty hugged the bag tightly to herself, feeling how its weight became her last support, and resolutely, despite all the danger, decided to go and help her friend, realizing that now she must become his salvation in this cruel world. The mercenaries, lifeless on the floor, seemed dead. Their bodies were covered in blood, and even time seemed to have stopped, as they succumbed to neither life nor death, leaving only traces of violence on this terrible field of brutal battle. Ak Woo Ron was barely able to stand on his feet, and his efforts seemed to have no end, because the attackers did not leave him the slightest chance. Their attacks were merciless and indomitable, and every step they took brought him closer to the abyss. But he stood, fighting to the last. The young man was covered in bleeding wounds. His entire body was bleeding, and his breathing became heavy and intermittent, but he clutched the hilt of his sword, ready to fight to the last, despite his weakness, for his determination was stronger than any pain and fear. His hand, trembling from fatigue, held the sword with difficulty, but his thoughts were only about the girl, about how she could find shelter and run away, hoping that the young noblewoman could find a way out while he had the chance to protect her even for a moment. Suddenly, he heard a creak coming from the place where the exit was, and in the blink of an eye, he turned around, peering warily into the dark corridor, waiting for the appearance of someone or something that could change the course of this tense and dangerous moment. There appeared a girl who arrived in time and saved him from being hit by another opponent's blade. Her determination and courage proved stronger than her fear, and at that moment, she became his hope, pulling him out of the abyss of despair, pain, and mortal threat. The two of them, completely exhausted, fell to the floor, unable to stand any longer, and the noblewoman, clutching the bag in her hands, tried to maintain at least some clarity in this chaos, not giving in to despair and not losing her fortitude and determination in this dangerous world. Ak Woo Ron immediately sat up, trying his best not to show his weakness, and asked the lady if she was okay. His voice sounded hoarse, but there was deep concern and worry in it that she would be okay despite their dire situation. She gave him a short, sweet smile, her eyes shining with confidence, as if she could turn the world around, and promised that everything would be fine with them, the feminine words sounding like gentle consolation, filling his soul with warmth and sudden hope. The handsome man stared at his companion in bewilderment, not understanding why she had not left, but had stayed nearby, when it seemed that it would have been better for her safety to leave, because the danger was so close that any moment could have been decisive. Ak Woo-ran became wary when he suddenly heard a noise. His intuition told him that the time for distractions was extremely inappropriate. Enemies, rivals, they were surrounded on all sides, and every step could lead to even greater danger. The blade was stuck into the floor, its edge biting deep into the wood, leaving behind only the sounds of metal tearing through the silence, a symbol of how close the threat was and how little chance there was for survival in this bloody encounter. The young man covered his companion with his body, protecting her from possible danger, not giving her even the slightest chance to be injured, because his only goal at that moment was to ensure her safety, despite his own injuries and fatigue. Ak Woo-ran then asked why the lady had come back here, to which she replied that she had magic beads that could help them in their current situation, saving them both from the imminent disaster they were in and giving them a chance to be saved. Young Ak Woo-ran turned to her in shock, not believing his ears, as he realized that these beads could be the key to their salvation, and now they were the only chance to survive, while the danger continued to approach with each passing moment. The girl apologized for causing him trouble, and her voice trembled with emotion, while the guy himself, despite his pain and fatigue, thought about how to use the beads correctly and how to distract his rivals so that they would have at least a little time to save themselves. Ak Woo-ran immediately realized that her behavior had changed because she stood in front of him as if she was ready to do anything to save them, and it was clear. He had been rude to her earlier, and now she might have done it not only for herself, but also to atone for her guilt. The little girl cried, asking for forgiveness for being a burden and causing him trouble, her voice trembling and tears streaming down her cheeks, because she felt guilty for everything that happened, despite her determination to help him. The warriors, however, stopped attacking, as if they had received a signal, and now stood waiting for their leader. Apparently, they were waiting for a command, because the young lady appeared, and this became, for both Ak Woo-ran and the girl, a moment of hope that everything could change. The girl still held the bag of beads tightly in her hand, but despite this, she felt that her position remained unsafe, because the surrounding threat did not disappear, and every step could be her last if she did not take action. Suddenly, unable to restrain himself, the young man asked the girl if she still decided to leave this place. Could she give him the bag of beads and promise that next time she would bring persimmon, which was so tasty and which he loved so much? The girl was a little confused, but trying to be honest, she answered that the doors to his house were closed, to which Ak Woo-ran, with a slight smile, said that he would open all the doors for her to come in and would accept anything she brought, even if it was candy. These words gave the boy confidence and joy, and a warm smile appeared on his face, because after everything they had been through, he finally felt that their relationship had become the same, as if the heavy burden of misunderstanding had disappeared, giving way to quiet trust.